I lived in a farm around 4 years ago. From the moment we moved there, I could tell something was wrong. I felt uneasy in there, as if there was something constantly spying on me. A little detail about the place and situation. We didn't technically own the place. It was borrowed from a woman that was trying to sell it. Call it a demo. So we didn't have access to the house and slept on the wooden storage house. The farm itself was like this. There was a barbed wire gate that you manually had to move in the entrance, and in front of it was an open empty field with one of those outside washrooms to the right. Passing by it, there was a small group of trees, and then the place where we slept. Passing that was the actual house to the left, and then the forest. In the forest entrance there was a tree with a ripped plastic bag tied to its branches, meaning the bag had been tied there for a while. It was still small, and people used to do that here to make marks or something. And right in front of it, there was a mound. Someone buried something there. I moved there with 4 dogs, plus the dog that already lived there that we took care of. Our routine was to wake up at 5 a.m. to go to the city, so I could go to school and my parents could go to work. The first night we stayed there, I noticed my room was the only one in the entire house that didn't have a lock, and I couldn't sleep because of the weird feeling I had, and I stayed up all night and slept on my way to school. Then things got weirder. The door started opening at night. I dismissed it as the wind. Cliché, I know, but it became more frequent and violent. Then, still on the first week, I saw it. It was a black humanoid figure with a white face. It was like the white face had empty sockets, and instead of a mouth, just an empty cavity in its face. It stood on my door entrance staring at me. I decided I would not sleep while I lived there, and I would bring myself to move or do anything. So I just kept staring at it to convince myself my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, some nights later, it became impossible to pretend, because it started moving and doing things. It entered my room, tapped on the window. It was a metal window that was right beside my bed, and slightly moved things and kept being a general creep. Whenever I shone light on it, it disappeared, but the eerie feeling persisted. I started keeping a flashlight in my room and playing music to keep myself calm and awake. Eventually I started falling asleep in some days, and in those days I would wake up with headaches and the feeling my eyes had been pushed into my skull. Every time I awoke, it was in pain. My parents eventually got security cameras because while we were in the city, some people entered the place to go fishing, as there was a shortcut to the neighboring farm lake through our forest. This is an important detail. Then one day my aunt went to visit. She had some weird superstitions and said the place had gold buried in it for some reason. She went to the forest and saw the mound under the marked tree I spoke about earlier, and decided it was a good idea to dig it up. Bad idea. I was digging it, and I need to describe what happened now very well to pass the feeling, so bear with me. There is a certain feeling of digging dirt that differs from rocks or mud or clay. I learnt this that day as I dug the hole. Then after going through a small layer of fragmented rock, I hit something soft and resistant that felt like leather. I hit it harder and pushed through it. Immediately after it, there was something hard with a complex and detailed shape. I tried to break through it since my aunt insisted it was a protection for the gold, and my parents were just whipping me into helping her. But it was no use, and it occupied most of the area of the hole, so we couldn't dig around it. It was like the hole was made specifically to bury it. My aunt then said she would cover the hole. She didn't cover it, and we went home. That night was hell. There was no tapping on the window. There was a strong banging. The thing kept entering my room non-stop, and even the flashlight wasn't working. I had to stay awake, feeling everything pressuring me. My door wouldn't close, and the thing would make noises and would be there staring at me. Now this is the part that makes the security cameras so important. They stopped working the moment it all started. There were 4 cameras, one pointing towards the farmhouse, one of them pointing to the washroom, one of them that showed my window, and one that pointed towards the forest. That morning I went to check on the camera footage, and all the cameras had stopped working except the one pointing at the forest. There was only static for the other 3, but that one had a small blur. After that night, it never appeared again. I still couldn't sleep because of fear, but it never actually showed up and things got calmer. We moved out some time after that. I keep thinking about it every now and then. 4 years later, it was too real, and there were things that were noticed by other people too. I especially keep thinking about the thing we hit while digging, and how that night was the worst. I keep asking myself if we found a body, or some haunted object that was hidden. 5 years ago, I worked as a CNA at an Eastern Tennessee nursing home. Not for me. I had a resident named Helen, who upon getting my hall assignment, was told by my hall partner that they all believed her to be possessed. Ha, right, whatever. First off, I'm not religious. Second of all, I've seen too many elderly folks acting crazy by the grace of Father Time. That's the Bible Belt for you. So I just smiled and nodded, because why be rude? Helen turned out to be one of the more difficult residents, to say the least. She was wheelchair bound and could scoot herself up and down the hall, muttering to herself, and sometimes without warning, she would attack someone close to her, be it a fellow resident, staff, or visitor, clawing, hitting, and kicking, until she was pulled off the bewildered person. She did have incredible strength when these attacks happened, and she would growl these deep, guttural growls the whole time. We ended up having to keep her isolated in a room alone, with her wheelchair locked to keep the other residents safe. A few months into the job, I switched to night shift on the same hall, because the shift differential was a little over $1 more on the hour. I was told by the night shift nurse that Helen was just as much a handful at night as she was during the day. One night, while I was walking down the hall to do my midnight vitals, I smelled the familiar stench of fecal matter when I stopped by Helen's room. I thought maybe evening shift left a dirty adult diaper in the trash can, as they sometimes do it if they're in a rush to get through their end-of-shift dry routine. The trash cans are right by the inside of the doors, so that the housekeepers can easily reach in and empty them. I stuck my head in the room, and by the light from the hall I could see the trash can was empty, but the stench was unmistakable and very strong. I stepped into the room and paused. I could hear Helen's raspy, low muttering. It creeped me out more than usual because on night shift there was only one CNA per hall. I was alone. The nurse was at the nurse's station. It was dark in there, and Helen was awake. Her bathroom was to the left of her door, so I reached in and turned the light on. I was horrified at what I saw when I stepped past the bathroom and came in view of Helen's bed. She lay there on her backside facing me with her bony hand. She was wiping her own feces on the wall, but there was red mixed with the brown. After calling the nurse, The two of us discovered she hadn't just played in the bowel movement she made in her adult diaper. She had dug it out of herself, ripping the thin, delicate anal tissue in the process, wiping the poop, bloody mixture all over the wall. She never made out like she felt any of it. We had to start restraining her through the night. Another night, a new charge nurse had gotten assigned to my hall. In the mornings before day shift started, the nurse had to give all morning meds. I warned her not to interact with Helen unless I was with her. "That little bitty old thing?" she asked. "She can't be more than 85 pounds soaking wet." 87.5, I said. "And it takes 5 CNAs to bathe her." She looked at me like she didn't believe me, but agreed to let me know before she medicated her. Right before I started my end of shift charting, the nurse told me she was ready to administer Helen's meds. I nodded, stood up, and followed her into Helen's room, where she still lay restrained. I went to get a pair of gloves from the dispenser, but they were empty. I turned to the nurse and said, "I'll run to the stockroom for a box of gloves. Don't touch her until I return." I saw the nurse's eyes roll as I exited the room. Coming back from the stockroom, I heard cries of help ringing down my hall. The CNA from the adjacent hall was already running towards the sound, and I followed. The source was the ever-doubting newbie nurse who had undone the wrist straps of the sweet old lady and was now being clawed at. She had a hand full of her hair from the back of her head and was digging her fingers into her throat, which were all scratched up and starting to bleed. Helen was screaming in a guttural rasp, "We hate you." It took me, the other CNA, and another nurse to pry Helen's fingers off my nurse and restrain her again. The nurse from the other hall was cleaning my nurse's wounds while I took down the incident report. She said through sobs that after I left, Helen spoke to her in a sweet voice, told her good morning and smiled at her. She asked if she wouldn't mind helping her go to the bathroom. Helen was incontinent and hadn't used a toilet in over a year. The nurse told her that of course she would and removed the wrist restraints. When Helen suddenly pounced, she cried harder, saying her voice, even the smell of her, completely changed. I charted the nurse had deep lacerations to her throat and was missing a patch of hair. Helen had ripped it from her skull. She quit that night. There were many other instances, and I became terrified of caring for that woman. The worst happened on my last night working at the nursing home. I was about to leave. I had already clocked out, but remembered I needed to tell the day shift CNAs about a resident having an out-of-facility doctor appointment, that one of them would need to have to ride with them. I spotted them down the hall and called out to them walking in their direction. I was passing Helen's room, did a double take and stopped dead in my tracks. Day shift had already gotten Helen up and in her wheelchair. It was in locked position in the middle of her room, but she'd somehow had gotten one of her hands free from the restraint and was chewing the index finger of said hand. It was all a blur. I screamed something. I ran into the room and the day shifter nurse ran with me. It took all of us to wrestle her finger out of her mouth. She was screaming in protest and growling the whole time. Mouth of yellow and jagged teeth covered in blood and bits of flesh. Helen had chewed the meat off most of her right index finger. The doctor was called in, and he said he'd never seen anything like it, and she would need skin graft surgery. It was more than I could take. I walked out of the nursing home and never returned. I didn't give any notice either. I didn't even call. I remained traumatized by Helen and never worked as a CNA again. This happened a while ago. To give you some context, I'm a male in my mid-20s, and at the time lived at home with my parents. We lived in a bigger than average house with a furnished basement apartment in a safe city in Canada. I lived in said basement apartment, while my parents lived on the top floor, the third story. Hearing noises and sounds from upstairs, mainly footsteps or doors opening and closing, is not unusual at all if you happen to live in the basement. When my younger siblings come home from college, these noises can be heard late into the night, at 2 or 3 a.m. even. My younger sibling would sometimes have a car with him, so you could hear the garage door open at odd hours as he would park his car inside. Needless to say, hearing noises while sleeping was never a cause for concern for me, and I had simply become used to it. But during the Christmas period a few years back, over the course of a few nights, I experienced strange occurrences that were downright mysterious, eerily creepy, and borderline paranormal. My parents had flown south to a Mexican resort to get away from the cold, and my younger brother decided to stay at his college town to party with his roommates. I was alone in the house for at least a week, until my parents returned, which wasn't really a problem for me. On the first night, I came home from a buddy's place at 11 p.m., watched a bit of TV, then decided it was time for bed. Before heading down to my room in the basement, I armed the security system, which, short of a security camera, was quite thorough. If anyone were to open any of the doors or windows of the house, a loud alarm would go off. The only way to disarm it is through an app. But if the alarm continued ringing for over a minute, the cops would be notified. I jumped into bed, and after a bit of Instagramming, I dozed off. A few hours later into my sleep, I was awoken by the loud sound of the garage door opening. Strange, I thought, because as I said before, no one was home or due home for a week. 30 seconds later, I heard another loud sound. This was of the garage door closing. At that moment, I thought nothing of it. Just maybe thought that my brother decided to drive home earlier than planned. Still, I tried to stay up and hear who it was that arrived home, or to see if the alarm would go off. After 30 more seconds of waiting, sleepy me decides that it's probably just my brother, who parked his car in the garage and is now taking his time to come inside, probably smoking a cigarette or something. I doze back to sleep, and nothing strange happens for the rest of the night. When I woke up, I went upstairs next morning, and there was no sign of my brother. No sign of any forced entry. The security system hadn't been triggered, and everything looked good. I even called my brother to see if he came home at all last night. He hadn't. Even the garage was empty, and didn't look like anything had been taken. I shrugged it off as me imagining things, sleep paralysis, or just a really vivid dream, and went to work for the day. The next night, I had the same routine as before. After work, I hung out with some friends, came home, armed the security system, and went to bed. I was sleeping peacefully, having even forgotten about the events of the previous night, when all of a sudden, I'm woken up by the loud sound of the garage door opening. I sat up in bed, trying to make sense of what the hell is going on, and then decided it was worth exploring. I grabbed my baseball bat and jacket and head upstairs. As I exit the main door, locking it behind me, and make my way to the garage, a sense of fear comes over me. The garage door is indeed open, and the light inside has been switched on. However, no one is in sight. I pinched myself, almost in disbelief, trying to make sure that I'm actually awake, then decide to walk around the house just to make sure everything is alright. It's 2:30 a.m. at this point, and the neighborhood is eerily quiet. My footsteps in the snow seem to be quite loud, but oddly enough, the neighbor's dog, who just about barks at anything that moves, has been quiet this whole time. As I proceeded to the backyard, the motion light turns on, and what I see next moves me to my very core. Footsteps in the snow, and they look fresh. The trail suggests someone must have hopped the fence and gone window to window to take a peek inside. Although disturbing, that seemed logical enough of a conclusion. Though how exactly this person got into my garage, I'm still not sure. At this point, I decided to call the cops. The cops showed up after about 30 minutes and walked around the place trying to find clues. Besides the footsteps, nothing worthwhile was found. However, one of the cops flashed his light over the fence into the neighbor's backyard, from where I thought the footsteps came into mine, but found no footsteps at all. I found that extremely worrying, but the cops seemed to explain it away by saying someone probably traversed the fence and landed straight into my yard. I wasn't buying it, but seeing as though nothing had been stolen or damaged, there was little the cops could do at this point. After they left, I went back inside my house and stayed awake a while longer to see if anything else transpired. Luckily, the rest of the night went incident-free, and I ended up passing out on the living room couch shortly after. On the third night, after work, I came straight home, cooked myself a quick dinner, and then went to bed, or at least tried to sleep. That was around midnight, but what happened the previous 2 nights kept me up for a while. Finally, after staying up waiting to see if something had happened, I passed out at 2 a.m. This time the sound that awoke me was not the garage door opening, but the sound of the alarm. Maybe it was because I was on high alert, or just that I never was fully asleep. But the minute the alarm started ringing, I was on my feet, baseball bat in hand, prepared for an altercation. I had decided I'd let the alarm ring out without disturbing it, thinking the cops would come rushing to my aid. The alarm kept ringing for what seemed like an eternity. It had probably only been a couple of minutes in reality, and my heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it. That's when it occurred to me. I hadn't heard any sound coming from upstairs, no footsteps, no door opening or closing, no noise of a forced entry through a window or something like that. I mustered up all the bravery I could and ventured out of the basement onto the ground floor of the house. After switching on all the lights that were in my way, I called out to see if I could get a response from someone that was there. If there was actually someone at all. There was no indication that anything had happened though, and after turning off the alarm, I did a quick check of the doors and windows in the rest of the house. By this point, I was too scared to venture outside like previous nights, and only did so once the cops showed up 30 minutes later. It was the same officers. We did a quick check around the house to see if there was anything suspicious, and once again found footprints in the snow. But these were at a different place. These footsteps came across the front driveway and made their way to the side of the house, only stopping at a lower window that looks into the basement. I looked directly into my bedroom. By this point, I'm terrified, and once the cops leave, I decide to drive to a nearby hotel for the rest of the night. Once there, I contemplated calling my parents, but didn't want to stress them out during their much-needed vacation, and didn't want to seem like I was scared in front of my brother, who'll probably just make fun of me anyway. I decided I'd go back home, and the next day replace the batteries on all security system sensors, as I had managed to convince myself that was the problem. But it obviously doesn't explain the garage door opening randomly the 2 previous nights. The next night, I came home from work early, replaced the batteries of the sensors like I said I would, armed the security system and went to bed. This time, it was in my parents' room, which was on the top floor. I did not want to have some creep watching me while I slept, though I ended up not doing any sleeping at all at night, in any case. I had just brought my baseball bat up with me in case. Around 2:30 a.m. that night, while watching some Netflix, I hear the alarm go off once more. This was out of the blue, with no sounds or noises of forced entry or broken windows. I jump to my feet, pick up the baseball bat and start walking to the door, fully intending to leave the room and see what the hell was actually happening. But just as I got to the door, something inside told me that was a bad idea. I ended up locking the door instead. Mind you, the alarm is still going off, and I wasn't waiting 30 minutes again for the cops to show, and decided to dial 911 myself, using my cell phone. Still, there are no footsteps or any sounds of movement. I walk to the window to see if anyone's out here, but there's nothing. Just as the 911 operator picks up and begins asking me what my emergency is, I hear the sound of the doorknob rustling. Someone was trying to enter my room, but this was no ordinary rustling either. It was fast, relentless, and violent, almost as if the person trying to turn it were doing so at 100 miles an hour. I began yelling into my phone, "Someone is in my house trying to kill me." The operator tried asking me for more information, but I was in such a daze I just yelled out my address and told them to send the police right away. I threw the phone on my bed, grabbed my bat, gripping it as tightly as I could, waiting for whoever or whatever it was to finally break through and come and get to me. But just a few seconds later, the rustling stops. The alarm is still ringing, but I hear no sounds of footsteps nor movement, which at this point is making my imagination run wild, thinking of ghosts or other paranormal stuff. I was still standing there, bat in hand, waiting for some sort of dramatic entrance, but it never came. Instead, I heard the siren of 2 police cars make their way down the street and into my driveway, and at this point, I decided I'd rather jump out the window onto the garage than onto the driveway to be with the cops, than stay another minute in the house alone. It didn't matter that it was freezing outside, or if I wasn't wearing my jacket. I just wanted to leave. Once I broke the window and got on top of the garage, I managed to get the attention of the cops, who helped me down and then asked if that person was still inside. I was on the verge of tears by this point. I could only manage a nod. 3 of the officers went to check out the rest of the house, while 1 stayed with me. About 5 minutes later they returned, saying there were no signs of forced entry anywhere. I'm freaking out at this point, trying to figure out what the deal is with the doorknob upstairs. They then went inside the house to see or find any clues, and surprisingly, or not, found nothing. By this point, one of my neighbors, who's always been pretty helpful, noticed the commotion and decides to see what's happening. He must have noticed I wasn't wearing a jacket and brought me one. Meanwhile, the cops decide there's nothing more they can do and ask me to check with the security company about inspecting the system that's been installed, in case it was faulty. As for the doorknob, they seemed understandably skeptic, but seeing the state I was in at that point, decided not to probe me too much. The same officer offered me to let me crash on his couch for the night, as well as some extra food, and I was glad to not be sleeping in that house. The next morning over breakfast, my neighbor calls and tells me he has a security camera installed outside of his house, which actually captures a bit of my driveway, and asks if I'd want to watch it to get some closure. I say yes. So he pulls out his laptop and begins playing the video from the night before. What we saw scared the jeepers out of both of us, and I think his skepticism completely melted away. We saw that at around 2:15 a.m., a bald man wearing nothing but dark-colored clothes walks up the street and stops right in front of my driveway facing the house. He doesn't continue walking, so technically he was never on my property, but he was there nonetheless, just staring without any movement whatsoever, hands by his side. At 2:20, he starts rocking back and forth, still with his feet planted in the same spot, and he continues doing this for 10 minutes until 2:30, which is exactly when my alarm went off. He then turns around and walks back in the direction he came in, walking out of view. I was completely shaken upon seeing that footage. It was so unreal, and although I didn't believe in the paranormal or ghosts, that bit had me questioning everything I thought I knew. We checked the tapes from the previous 3 nights, and what I found was truly disturbing. The same person, bald, wearing dark clothes, walked up the street around 2:15, stopped in front of my driveway, and went through his usual routine. The second and third night this took place, I had come outside with a bat to investigate, but he would promptly leave at 2:30, basically minutes before I or the cops had a chance to see him. But what was truly strange was that in the video at least, he never once came to my backyard or even to the side of my house toward my basement window. He just stood at the foot of my driveway staring and swaying at the house, then left. I handed the recordings over to the cops, but unsurprisingly he was never caught or found. I called my brother that day and asked him to come and stay with me until our parents arrived. Thankfully nothing happened after that night, but it did leave some lasting mental scars, as I slept with all the lights on in my room for a year after that, and now I need a light to sleep, as well as leaving me with tons of questions. Who the hell was that? How did he/it know I was sleeping there that night? What was his deal with the alarm going off and the garage door opening out the blue? For the record, we had someone come and check up on the system, and it was supposedly working fine. And it did work fine after that night. And what of the snow prints? How the hell did that doorknob hold for as long as it did? Did the thing on the other side intend on coming in at all? What would have happened if it did? I was sitting outside my work having a smoke. 4 a.m. Not a soul in sight. A man came up to me, asked if I had a spare cigarette. I politely declined. Normally this just elicits some grumbling, then they amble off. Not this time. Buddy decided to dig in his heels. He had all his earthly belongings on his back, and a gigantic glass bottle of vodka that he started swinging around. He also had the kind of eyes that would give a lion tamer the heebie-jeebies. Not an ideal combination in someone who's getting up in your unarmed face. You better give me a smoke. No, dude. Sorry. I said give me a smoke. You don't know who you're dealing with. He starts to loom over me, getting a bit too far into my space bubble. I stood up, all 5'3" of me. The only things I had going for me were steel toe-cap boots and a really bitchy look. The man backed up a step and then came back even closer. He was directly in my way back to the door. He took my motion as a threat as he immediately ramped up his act. If you don't give me a cigarette, I'm gonna end you. No one will find you. Now look me in the eyes, woman. I'm looking at you in the eyes, I replied firmly, planting my feet and giving him my best graveyard shift stare. Anyone who's worked night shifts will know what that stare is. He kept insisting. I looked him in the eye, and I kept replying just as fast that I already was, and what was he gonna do about it? Don't try me. I'll drag you by your hair to the bushes, and then you'll see. Getting closer still and holding the vodka bottle up. This is when I started getting really loud. Get out of my face and back off. Get out of here now. In true predator fashion, he got all nervous at the sudden yelling, and while he kept threatening me with all sorts of heinous things, and was looking around quickly for any witnesses, this is when I knew I was in trouble if someone didn't come along. I cannot emphasize enough how creepy this guy was being. I've actually abbreviated most of what he said, but luckily my co-worker finally heard the commotion and came barreling out, already on the phone to the police. The man started threatening her as well, then realized who she was on the phone with and quickly walked away, slurring more insults as he went. The police came and I gave a detailed description, but they never found him. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if my co-worker hadn't come out when she did. My parents explore abandoned towns and mines as a hobby. When I was younger, I would get dragged along with them, but when I started college, I stopped going with them. However, in those times that I did go with them, I did encounter a lot of things that made me feel uneasy. Of course, I am and always have been a skeptic, so I always just assumed that it was the atmosphere getting to me. But there was one time that I legitimately can't explain what I saw. For context, I live in Arizona, and most of the places we explored were in the northern part of the country. There's quite a few towns in that area that are dying or have already died, and there are plenty of mines that have long since been out of operation. I can't remember where this encounter took place, but I do know my parents wanted to visit it after they saw some paranormal investigation show cover the site of this abandoned mine. My parents aren't exactly paranormal investigators, but they do like visiting and photographing creepy locations, and supposedly haunted locations usually end up having some truly haunting imagery. Getting to this mine was more trouble than any of us expected. The road was so rough that we had to park off to the side and walk a mile or two to even get there. I don't remember if she heard this from anyone in the local town, or if it was mentioned in the TV show, but apparently a few years prior a couple of kids went exploring at the mine and went missing. It was an assumption that the kids probably fell down an open shaft, as they weren't blocked off, and once I got a good look at them myself, they truly looked like bottomless pits. More so than any other creepy place we have visited, I just felt so uncomfortable here. I'm not a particularly violent person, but a voice in the back of my mind kept telling me to push my stepmom down into the mine shaft. After all, she was standing right in front of them with her back turned to me while she was trying to take pictures down it. No matter how much I tried to shake off the idea, I couldn't help but feel like it was in my best interest to just push her down. Once she stepped away from the bottomless pit, the thought went away and I felt like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I've heard that these kind of morbid thoughts aren't too uncommon, especially around ledges, but part of me feels like this was different, even though I can't say I have any proof that it was. I just had this feeling, this overwhelming hatred come over me in those moments that she stood standing in front of it, and a few seconds felt like hours. After she was done taking pictures around that area, She went to go photograph some other areas while my father and I started walking down a path to see if there was anything of interest on the other side. While we were coming around a bend in the path, we saw someone else. It was a man who looked to be in his mid-20s. He was decked out in full mining gear, and although I'm no expert on mining attire, it definitely looked old-fashioned. He gave us a wave and walked off the path towards an empty clearing, where I assume there probably were more open shafts, although I wouldn't know, because my father immediately turned to me and told us we had to leave. I've tried coming up with explanations for who this man was, but there are lots of things that didn't add up. The mine there wasn't operational, so obviously there wouldn't be anyone in full mining gear walking around. I considered for a long time that it could have just been a practical joke of some kind on anyone who went there after seeing the paranormal TV show. However, we saw no vehicles on the way up the rugged road, and we didn't visit this place right after it featured on said TV show. It must have been at least 6 months after. Not to mention it's not easy to find. We literally had to hunt down locals and ask them for directions, because Google wasn't helpful in telling us where to go, as the road leading to the mine was unmarked. It's been 7 years, and I still get chills whenever I think about it. I worked permanent night shifts in a large care home for 2.5 years. It was a really old house that had been converted and had bits added onto it. Often it sometimes buzzed in the night and would wake up at least one other person who would usually want the toilet, a drink, or think it was the time to wake. Our duties involved helping people to bed, then some lights, cleaning the laundry, and we stayed as quiet as we could in order not to wake anyone. Every now and then, we would have several people all buzz within 2 minutes of each other, asking us to tell the children to stop running around and playing outside, and asked why they were up so late and where their parents were. This was only on one side of the building. Several other staff members believed it to be haunted as well. I worked the night shift at a local McDonald's. I had to fill in for my friend Kiara, who called in sick. This night was probably one of the most terrifying nights I have ever worked. It was dead around 11 p.m, as I was asked by the manager to sweep the floors until a customer came in. One customer came in, and he looked a bit rough. He had a long, rusty beard, glasses, sandals, and just clothes that had stains on them. I go over to the register and say, "Hello, can I get you anything?" "Yeah, I'll have a large coffee, please." I take his order and give him his coffee and tell him, "Have a wonderful night, sir." He smiles. I resume sweeping the floor again as I see this man sitting a bit close to where I could be sweeping, which is usually under the tables and just around the floors. When I reached his table, he says, "You're very beautiful." "Thank you so much," I say, with a smile. "Can I give you a ride home when you get off work?" "Oh, no thank you, I have a ride home." He becomes the opposite of the nice man that I took the order from, to just pure rude. "What's your schedule?" "I'm not allowed to give out that information, sorry." He takes his coffee and goes back outside. The next night, after that, Kiara and I worked together, and my other guy friend Jack too. I told Kiara about the guy from the night before, and she gave me a weird facial expression. Jack comes over and says, "Monica, is everything okay?" I tell him about the guy from the night before, and he gave me a look of terror. What he said sent chills running down my spine. The man called the restaurant earlier, and asked about you." My blood ran cold as I saw the same man walk back in. Kiara's face went pale, and Jack's stomach dropped. My stomach turned in knots, and I say, "Hello, can I get you anything tonight?" "No, but can I take you home?" Jack steps out and says, "No, she ain't going anywhere with you. Get out before I call the cops." The manager got pissed off at Jack for leaving his position at the drive-thru window while Kiara was frying burgers, and Jack agreed to switch positions with me until the morning crew came in. The manager asked me to take the trash outside. I nervously said okay. Jack, on the other hand, was furious that the manager asked me to do it. Jack was nice enough to do it for me. I stayed by inside, and Jack comes in and pulls me into the janitor's closet and says, "That guy was waiting for you in his truck with 5 other big guys in there." I felt sick to my stomach when he said that. Jack informs the manager, and, like the asshole that she was, says, "He's not gonna hurt anyone. He's harmless. Get back to work." The next morning, me and Jack worked together, and my co-worker Taylor informs me that the man has come back, and told him my schedule and that he will wait for me to come back today. I was sick of it, until I saw him come in. Jack, being the good friend that he was, told him to get out of the restaurant and never return, or else he'd call the cops. Jack lost his job because of this, but to me he was just looking out for me. I cried when Jack lost his job, because I knew Kira would be working alone without anyone else to protect us, but I never saw the man again after that. I quit my job at McDonald's, and so did Kiara. Me, Jack and Kiara now live in the same apartment building and work at a grocery store. I don't know what could have happened to me if I took out the trash that night, and not Jack. I'm just happy I never saw that creep again. I am an avid urban explorer, and in December a friend and I drove to a location about 45 minutes away from home. It was in a small town in Pennsylvania. To get to the abandoned house, and more or less crumbling house, we had to drive on a 1-lane road through a forest. When we entered that road, there was a dead deer lying on the side of the road. Not uncommon, but it would be later on. Then her GPS malfunctioned and told us to return to the route, even though we were already on it. The arrow was pointing in the opposite direction we were going, away from the forest. We kept driving anyway and turned into the parking lot. There were only a few cars. There's a walking trail in the forest that people use to bike and run. We go to the structure, an old water tower, and take some pictures, and opt to walk on the trail. We're both feeling really off, like there was a secret that everyone on the path knew except for us. We were the only ones on the path, and we were walking and making small talk, when we heard a bike bell behind us. We turn around, and a woman goes ahead of us on her bike, and then stops to tie her shoe. We keep walking, and my friend says, "Look at her bike, there's no bell on it." So we have no idea where the bell came from. There were only about 4 cars in the parking lot, but we ended up passing over 30 people. They all stared at us too, never breaking eye contact. Then my friend pointed out something, a boulder that had a stream of water trickling down it, but there wasn't a source or a crack. It was just starting from the middle of the rock. Again, it was weird. We kept walking down the trail, and I stopped and pointed into the forest. There was a tall black figure standing far by the trees. It looked like a man, but I couldn't make out any clothes or even a face. We were looking at it, when there was a loud snapping noise right behind us, like a tree branch. We turned around quickly. but there weren't any sticks or branches on the ground at all. When we looked back in the direction of the figure, it was gone, all in about 5 seconds. The entire time we felt drowsy and off, so we decided that we were going to walk back to the car and leave. There was no one else there, and no cars in the parking lot. We drove back through the forest road. We were only out there for about an hour, and when we got to the intersection that brought us out to the forest, the deer was still on the side of the road, except it was entirely bones. Just a skeleton, not even bloody. It was completely clean. All that was left was the head, which was still on the skeleton. Nothing could have eaten or skinned it that fast, especially not without leaving any fur or blood. At this point we were freaked out enough and just wanted to go home. And then her trunk opened. There's a certain button on the car that you have to press, and her hands weren't even near it. She got out the car to close it, and all of the doors in the car clicked and locked on their own, except my passenger door that stayed unlocked. We had service too, but her GPS wouldn't start to work again until we were out of that town. I don't really know what happened, but it felt like something in that place wanted us gone. And every time we pointed out something that was strange, something else would distract us from looking too closely at it. I'd love some closure to this. It still makes me feel uneasy. Sometimes I dream about it, and the same word always comes into the dream. Harvest. I don't know why. A couple of minutes ago I looked up the coordinates to the place, because I had them on my phone but couldn't remember the address. The people wanted to know where this place was, and the first thing to pop up was abandoned paper mills to be demolished on Friday. There was no talk of demolishing the place a month ago. Years ago, I used to work as a security guard in an abandoned psych complex that is now a heritage-listed site. At the time, there was a company trying to sell the land, so one others and myself were employed to run graveyard shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and ensure that kids didn't sneak and burn down the place and generally mess it up. One night around 2 a.m., when it was quite dark, the other guard and myself did our hourly patrol. While he circled counterclockwise, I went through the center of 4 different buildings to check for holes in the fence. While I had my torch, I saw a young lady who couldn't have been more than 22 to 25 years old, and quite pretty, although a little disheveled. She approached me and said that she was trying to find some men who had taken something from her. Of course, being the only one around, I asked her if there was anything more I could do, including phoning the police to come by. She declined with a short smile and seemed pretty despondent. Figuring that she might try and hurt herself, I said that I was here if she needed help, but it was a dangerous area, so I would escort her out. At this point, she gave one of the most blood-curdling screams I have ever heard, and tears streamed down her face, a quicker mood change, the likes of which I'd never seen. Taken aback is the least of my feelings. She screamed, "I'll find them! I'll find them!" before sprinting behind one of the buildings. It took me half a second to gather myself, but I started after her. Now I seriously thought that A, she would harm herself or someone else, B, drugs are one hell of a thing, as she disappeared behind one of the buildings, and not half a second later did my partner waltz out from behind that same building. He'd not seen anyone run past, nor heard a thing, and that scream was loud. Long story short, from here it turns out that this ward was functioning before any of the normal guidelines came into force, and it was obvious people there were treated worse than animals. Apparently, it was not unheard of for female psych patients to become pregnant. Who knows from where? and subsequently, their babies were taken from them at birth. I quit the next day, as did my partner. Nightclubs for me, thanks. About 10 years ago, I would have been in my early 20s. Me and two of my friends decided one night to head down some train tracks and break into an old abandoned coal mine on the outskirts of town. My friend had been there a week before exploring with a buddy, and so we climbed through a hole in the fence they had cut. This place was pitch black, and I had no experience with mining yards, so I could only imagine what these giant looming towers and silos were all around us. I could just barely make out these darker patches that were giant doors and holes in the structure, and hear scuttling noises beyond. These noises could easily be explained as pigeons or bats, so we were not too fazed. We continued to our destination. We knew that our town was surrounded by old World War II forts and bunkers, and there was one on a hill in the middle of the mine yard. As we slowly crept towards our goal, I kept hearing a small tapping noise. Not too alarming, just a small tick, 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 coming from the dark behind us in the direction we had come. We make it to the base of the hill that holds the bunker, and find some way to snake around the only pole light in the yard and up the hill. The whole time, we hear the soft tink, tink, tink behind us. Having made it up the hill, and faced with the option to head into the bunker, us brave men decide to pass. Little too creepy for us with no lights to find our way in or out. Instead, we decide to head around back, and this is where things get interesting. We find ourselves standing around a hole with a ladder leading down into a lower level on the bunkers, with that relentless tink, tink, tink coming from somewhere out in the shadows. Now, on two sides of us are the steep drop-offs of the hill. On the other sides are the walls of the bunker. We were boxed in on all sides, with only a small path leading out, and with the hole and ladder in the ground at our feet. So we decide this is a good place as any to light a joint, and so I break it out. With my back to the drop of the hill a few feet behind me, and the hole directly at my feet, I try. I'm on the top of a hill without much cover from the wind, and have a difficult time getting the joint lit, and I'm growing frustrated. Not to mention that the tink 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 is starting to get annoying. Up until this point, I assumed it was a metal sign hanging on the fence we climbed through, gently blowing in the wind, and so ignored it. Frustrated with the joint and getting annoyed with the sound, I turned around and stared in its direction. I asked my friends what they thought it was, and tried again to light the joint, but this time I was facing the noise. I did not try to conceal the flame. As soon as the lighter flashed, the noise changed from a soft tink, tink, tink into a thunderous boom. "Oh shit, security guards," was the first thing to pop into my head. That booming noise is them running down metal stairs in one of the dark towers. They saw my face when the lighter's fire illuminated me, and they must be on their way. All three of us crouch halfway between flight and fight, unsure if we should run, hide, or do nothing. We all decide to wait. It's too dark for them to find us easily, and they're so loud that we'll hear them the minute they get close. Boom! The noise just won't stop, and I swear it's getting louder. How long are those stairs, I think? This is weird. And I swear I hear movement in the grass in the darkness at the bottom of the hill. We all agree it was probably just the wind in the grass, but decide it was time to sneak our way out of this place. Slowly crouching through the dark, We move through the mining yard towards our exit when we run into a problem. Whatever is making the noise in between us and the exit. We squat down the middle of an open gravel road to try figuring out our next move. Safe in thought, it was just too dark for anyone to see us sitting there in the dirt. But just to be sure, we picked a spot that placed a large chain link fence between us and that god-awful boom boom boom. Now at this point I decided to upgrade the guards to cops in my mind, and I was becoming a bit antsy, but we decided to wait them out. I guess at this point we all realized that none of this is making any sense. The guards or cops should have reached the bottom of the stairs by now, and that's when it got even weirder. With the boom in front of us and nothing to do but wait if we wanted to use our only known exit, we start to hear something else. In the dark all around us, but somewhere close and on the same gravel we're crouching on, things start to move. There was a thud noise and then a slow scraping noise as something was dragged across the gravel. Then again from elsewhere, quiet but very close. These noises were all around us, thuds, then a slow dragging across gravel, but we could not really pinpoint in which direction they were coming from. At this point, I go from rational adult to scared kid, and think of all the people who died at this mine, or what could be living in those tunnels. In my mind, the noise went from guards to police, shot past ghost, and is now smack dab in the middle of goblin and giant rat. Of course, we have to get the hell out of there, and decide that climbing the fence behind the mine, running into the woods, and making our way into the highway is our only option. And so we pick our butts up out of the dirt and sneak as fast as we can the hell out of there. We're making it. The noises are now behind us and not getting any closer, and we find rows and rows of empty coal train cars. Perfect. We can walk freely between them with no chance of being spotted from a distance. With the end of the mine yard close by, and with the protection of the train cars, we relax a bit and talk in a less hushed whisper. I guess that was a mistake. A few seconds after entering the rows of train cars, the first car explodes in a boom noise. Whatever was making that booming noise was right behind us, only feet away. I have never in my life, nor I ever, I'm sure, moved so swiftly again. The hundreds of feet between me and the fence to the outside world flew by, and I still do not understand how I got over the 10-foot fence so easily. I just remember leaping off it into the dark. We made it into the road and ahead back to town. The roads bend around the mine, and we could still hear the relentless boom of something smashing that train. My friends got too uncomfortable talking about it and seemed content to forget anything weird ever happened. But my curiosity drives me nuts, and I've gone back there a few times over the years. Nothing out of the ordinary has happened, and the last time I went by myself, everything was torn down and taken away. This happened to my grandmother, and she swears up and down that what you are about to hear is true. Many years ago, she had an accident, as old ladies often do, and ended up breaking her hip. She had to be taken to the hospital, and it turned out that she had several problems with her, and that it would take a long time for her to heal. Most of the healing needed to be done in the hospital in order to monitor her and assure she was receiving the proper care, and finally, a care home, a sort of intermediary between hospital and home, before she could finally be discharged. I went to visit her a few times, and the conditions were appalling. There were so many people crammed into such small wards. The air was toxic and suffocating, and I knew my grandmother wasn't enjoying it. However, it wasn't before long that she was moved to a much nicer, far more comfortable place in the care home. I went to visit her there one afternoon and asked her how her day was, brought her some snacks, some flowers, and tried to cheer her up. I spoke with her all afternoon about all kinds of things, and just as I'm about to leave, she grabs my hand and looks at me in the eye. "Don't go," she says. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you, but I keep putting it off because I think I'm going mad." I give her a little smile and tell her it's all right and that I'll always believe her. Probably. She looks around to see who's looking and hearing. Thankfully, there was no one else in the room at the time as she was sitting up in bed. She squeezes my hand tightly and beckons me to come closer, and I do. She says, "There's a little girl who comes and plays in here at night. I don't know if she's one of the workers' children or something, but she's always here. She wakes me up when she skips across the room. She picks up things and puts them back like any curious child. And after a few minutes, I hear her singing gently in the corridor and then disappear." I look at her and ask, "Is that all?" And she nods, but then says, "She's here every night at the same time, 2 a.m. My grandma is a very light sleeper, and at first I told her that it was all right and that it was probably just a member of staff who had a child or something, trying my best to convince her. But my grandmother is no fool and looked at me in the eye and said, "I think we both know what's going on here." And she was right. We were both confident it was a ghost. But I told her not to worry, and that it might not come back, for she was quite frightened of it. So she ignored it and carried on as I left. I don't visit her for 2 days due to work, and when I come back, I again strike up a conversation with her. She tells me all about how she's excited that she's going to leave, as she's been given permission to leave next week, and she was incredibly anxious to go home. Again, just before I leave, does she squeeze my hand and tell me again that the little ghost girl had returned, but then more curiously, that my jacket had disappeared. She said that when she woke up at the sound of the little ghost girl, that this time she looked at her dead in the eye and just carried on skipping away. The thing is, I left my jacket on a chair next to my grandmother's bed, and when she woke up next morning it had been gone. She asked all of the day and night staff if they had moved it, but none of them seemed to be able to locate it. The days were ticking along quickly, and although I myself wasn't that concerned with the disappearance of my coat, as it was old and worn, my grandmother, with very little to do, had made it her mission to find what had happened to it. She was semi-mobile, as she had one of those frames, and she started scooting around the place, looking up and down, trying to find desperately where this coat was, which was very ill-advised according to the nurses. She didn't find it, but the day before she left, she was growing increasingly annoyed and got in a bad temper with the nurses, saying that they must have moved it and not forgotten, and even accused one of them of stealing it. When she fell asleep, she awoke as usual to the sound of footsteps skipping across the floor. She opened her eyes and saw the little girl quickly dart past the door of her room, and just as she was about to close her eyes again, did she notice my coat resting gently on the chair. She was convinced that either the ghost girl had moved it, and was returning it to her before her departure, or she had found where it had been lost and was giving it back. In any case, my grandmother thought it was a very nice gesture, and was happy and calm with the ghost girl for one last time. She left the next day, her health improved, and to this day she is still fine. But the question in my mind remained about these strange happenings. So about a year later, when I had some free time, I decided to look into the place where this hospital care home was. It turns out that in 1910, this was a school that operated in the area. It wasn't until the Second World War that this school was hit by a bomb. Although there were no kids here when it happened, there was a family that lived next to the school, and all of the inhabitants of that house perished. I came to find out that a family of 4, a son, a daughter, and a mother and father, had all lived there and died. I know the girl was around 10 years old and the son about 3, so it's likely in my head that the girl could have attended the school very next door to her home, and that this is where she chooses to haunt, as it must be where she spent many an hour and fun times during her brief life on this plane. Little ghost girl, thanks for getting me my coat back. I hope you have a safe and peaceful existence. In college, I was a late afternoon shift from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. security guard at a chemical factory on Sunday. I don't know what kind of chemicals they made, but it was comprised of 3 buildings and whose prior use was just an orange juice factory. It was cool, and the guy who would replace me at 11 was this big 6'3" guy. He would sometimes get dropped off early, and we would just chill and talk. Well, I had to walk to the property at 10:30 p.m. Every time I walked, I had no problems. Here's the thing. Of the 3 buildings, 2 were for actually mixing, heating and emulsification, and 1 building had administrative offices. That administrative office was always closed since it was the weekend. Well, one time, this guy gets dropped off at 10:15, and he decides to walk with me at 10:30. So the administrative building is last, and we're walking towards and everything is off. So we circle the building, and as we're walking back, the office light turns on. This was the first time I'd ever seen this, since no one is supposed to be there. I pull out my keys and start walking towards the building to enter and see if someone is inside. At this point, the guy looks at me, grabs my arm and says, "Don't go in there, just leave it." I turn and look at him, and his face looks dead serious. He's looking right at me like he's seen a ghost. You've got to realize I'm 19 years old, still a kid inside really, and not afraid of anything. But looking at his face made me nope the hell out of there. When we got back to the guard shack, he told me that once on his walks at around 3 a.m. the same thing happened. He went in and the office felt really cold. He turned off the light, and as he left the building it turned on again. He re-enters as he's about to turn it off, and he said something pushes him from behind. Immediately he turns around and exits the building and tells me he'll never step foot in it again. I talked to one of the old workers there about it, and he said that when the place was a juice factory, the building housed a larger juicer, and someone had an accident and died. Don't know if it's true, but the old worker told me he would never go in that building at night either. A few weeks later I quit, so that I would never have to deal with that again. This happened a few years ago, and I figured I'd share it, as I find myself wondering what happened almost every day. My friend and I were interested in investigating a nearby abandoned factory that had a fire happen in it many years ago. So we geared up, grabbing everything we could to make sure we would be okay going into this place. There was a shattered glass window at the back of the factory, where we were going to enter the building from. The first time we pulled into the parking lot, she told me that she didn't like the feeling she was getting, so I pulled away from the building. We turned down a road, seeing a shadow with no features walking down the side of the building. His gait suggested he was injured. So, I turned around, and he was closer this time. We turned around to leave again, with our eyes on him the entire time, and he was gone. We chose to leave at that very moment and try and find a new location, and my friend started to become very silent and unresponsive to me talking to her. As we passed a few places, she started speaking in a monotone voice, staring straight ahead the whole time. She was telling me that someone hung themselves at this place. Someone burnt to death here. Someone shot someone here. Meanwhile, I tried to converse with her to no avail. We left the city we were in and pulled into a Walmart. As we were sitting there, she suddenly came to, asking where we were and what time it was and why we were there. She had no recollection of anything she had said or of any location we had visited. I then showed her a half-hour recording of her that I took on my old cell phone, and she was shocked and had to leave immediately. I went home and researched all the deaths she was talking about, and they were all accurate. I've applied for many jobs because I'm the legal age for working, as I'm in high school. I am in need of money and need to help out my family, so at this point I would take any job. 5 jobs accepted me, so I decided to do a trial at my first job. That was quick enough to accept, which was McDonald's. I need to say that the staff and the manager are all nice, and my friend works there, which is a total bonus. The only downfall working there was probably the customers, which is something my friend agreed with. But anyway, I didn't know what to pick for shifts, or even if I wanted the job, so I asked for a practice shift. My manager happily agreed and let me choose my times. Instead of a day shift, I chose night, which was a bad decision, but hey, I needed to see what it was like working there. So this meant it would be easy since it's night, right? I was terribly wrong on that. I got ready in my friend's uniform that she let me borrow, and she even drove me there. I'll be honest, the McDonald's was rather sketchy. When I say sketchy, I mean there are so many alcoholics and druggies around, and upon arrival it didn't feel right. During the car ride, I had a gut feeling it wasn't going to be a good shift, but my friend kept reassuring me that it would be fine. She dropped me off at the bus stop, which was 5 minutes from my workplace, and said she would pick me up at 12 a.m. It was 10 p.m., so my practice shift only lasted 2 hours. I agreed and said for her to pick me up at the same spot she dropped me off. As she sped off, I merely watched as her car shrunk into the distance. After I saw it was gone, I started making my walk towards McDonald's. But while walking, I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't think much of it because it was a normal thing. The person was probably just walking to their car or McDonald's or even the shops. But I had a gut feeling. I felt like I was being watched, and I stopped for a second. The footsteps stopped with mine, and I looked behind me to see a guy around his mid-40s just eyeing me off. I got weirded out, as he just smiled at me and breathed heavily. He was taller than me and looked rather stronger and bigger. He was around what looked to be a few meters away, and I quickly looked away and ran off to my workplace. There were only 3 people working, my manager and my male friend. It was 10:30 p.m. and I had already had a share of drunken rude people filling the orders up. One even tried hitting on me, but he quickly left after my friend showed up to help. He helped me out with most things, and I felt rather safe with him. He was an acquaintance of mine, but we soon grew into best friends. After I was done taking some drunk guy's order, my friend pulled me aside and asked if I knew the guy outside. I was confused at what he meant, and at first I thought he was joking around, until he pointed at the right window. My mouth went dry, and my face dropped. It was the same old guy that was following me before work. I didn't tell him that, because I was an idiot. I just laughed a bit and said it was no big deal. He shrugged it off and went back to the kitchen. 11 p.m. hit, and no more customers were present, and the same guy would not stop staring at me. At that point, I held my head down and begged, hoping he wouldn't come in. I felt his beady eyes run up and down my body. It was gross. It made me feel dirty. He'd been there since the start of my shift. I started to panic a bit, as I was absolutely begging for him not to come in. In the middle of my thoughts, I heard something. My heart stopped, as it was the door opening. The creepy guy slowly walked towards my counter, eyeing my whole body until he was right in front of me, heavily breathing and drooling almost. His breath reeked like alcohol and cigarettes. He had a musky scent that, to be honest, nearly made me vomit. My red flag was high as I carried on with my nice act. He wouldn't stop staring at me. I glanced at my friend, who was busy in the kitchen, and I turned my attention back to the guy. No matter what I asked, he was silent for a whole 5 minutes, and that went on until he eventually said something. Beautiful skin, so young, short black hair. Such a nice complexion you have. Before I could even speak or try to call someone over, I wasn't prepared for what happened. The old guy launched towards me and tried entering the counterpart, which was the same part I was working at. He looked at me like I was a piece of meat. Trying to climb over the counter wasn't easy for him though, eventually trying to grab me and getting stuck midway, and I tried backing up. To my luck, I slipped and landed on my ass. I tried my best crawling away, hoping he wouldn't pass through. I was of course rather startled and afraid to the point where I couldn't utter a word. My friend dropped what he was doing as he screamed for my manager to come over. My manager quickly showed up, which made the old guy get back up to flee. My friend quickly ran to my aid, took me into the back room, which is what my manager told him to do in order to calm me down and to call the cops. I glanced at my friend, as he looked pale and rather puzzled, like he saw a ghost. My manager waited at the counter for the cops, and my friend quickly explained who the guy was. It turned out the guy was known for creeping on the female staff members while they worked. He would take pictures, ask for their number, offer alcohol, and even documented what they looked like. He was already banned from entering the place or even being near it. The cops were very aware of who he was due to his disturbing predatory behavior in the past, and apparently he even sexually assaulted one of the girls after their shift. After the whole investigation and getting questioned, it was 1 a.m., and I was free to go. My friend, the one that drove me, was with my other friend, the one who worked with me. And while I got questioned and was on my way home, my friend held my hand and kept reassuring me everything would be fine. Safe to say that I won't ever go back there again, and I don't trust any night shifts. I have plans of working at a different fast food establishment now. Back when I was in high school, my friends and I loved exploring creepy places. A few of us had our driver's license, so on weekend nights we would gather a group of 6 to 10 people and go on an adventure. One summer, our favorite place to go was this abandoned movie theater on the west end of town. This place had probably closed down about 3 years before we started visiting it, and in that time it had become a run-down building. There were no trespassing signs on the front entrance, and each of the fire exits around the building coming from the theater rooms. The glass at the main entrance was all broken and had been boarded up. The front door was busted and didn't latch or lock, so people were able to get inside. We knew there had to be homeless people crashing in there, but we were young and dumb and felt invincible as a group. It was part of what made it scary. We would always wait until between 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. to get into places like this, because we didn't want anyone to see or hear us or report us to the cops. We all explored it together the first 2 times we went in. The screens and seats were all torn up inside each of the maybe 8 rooms. The bathroom mirrors were broken, and there was graffiti everywhere. We were fairly sure there were people hiding in there while we were inside, even if we never saw anyone the first 2 times we went in. There were a couple of shopping carts from a nearby Fred Meyer's inside, with cans and bottles in them and a few dirty blankets scattered around in different rooms. It looked lived in. After getting to know the layout of the place the first couple of trips, we made a game of it for the 3rd and final visit. This time, the 6 of us that went split into 3 groups of 2, and with our partner, the 2 of us that would enter the front together and spend a full 5 minutes inside while the other waited outside at our chosen exit in the back building. The first 2, Beck and Doug, both went in while we waited outside. About 7 minutes went by, and just as we were starting to worry that we should go in after them, they made it out the other side through the fire exit. Doug told us that they went upstairs into the office, and there was a sleeping bag there that hadn't been there on the previous visit, and as soon as they went up there and saw it, they tried to leave immediately. But they turned around and tried to leave through the wrong exit. They were paranoid that they were being followed out, so they just stood there watching their way, entered the theater room for a minute, make sure they didn't hear any noise, before finally worked up the nerve to run out the right exit in the room across the hallway. Both Doug and Beck wanted us to leave, but Jack and I weren't having any of that and insisted on going in. Brad and Drew, the other 2 of the group that were going to go in last, wanted to come with us. So the 4 of us went inside while Beck and Doug both waited at the exit. The first thing we all wanted to do when we got inside was go check out the upstairs office. Just as we started to make our way up the stairs, we all heard a loud banging sound. It was coming from the back of the theater. We all agreed it had to be Beck and Doug trying to scare us, so that we could come out and we could leave. We got upstairs and the pounding stopped. Doug was right. There was a sleeping bag rolled out on the ground with a few paper bags set up around it. Brad flashed a light in one of them and saw a syringe and something that looked like a vibrator. We were all pretty grossed out and had a little laugh about it. We looked around up there and didn't really notice anything else interesting, and we were staring back down the stairs when the pounding started again. We decided we should probably make our way to the exit. I hoped we hadn't been caught trespassing by the cops. We came out through the exit and immediately both Doug and Beck were talking over themselves to tell us that about a minute after we entered, a really tall, homeless-looking, creepy man with greasy hair walked right past them, heading for the entrance. Beck said hello as he passed, and the guy stopped, turned and kind of lunged a few inches towards him before stopping. One side of his face was really wrinkly. Beck thinks that he might have been a burn victim or something. The guy stared him down for a few seconds, and then without saying anything, turned and walked around the corner where we had gone inside. They started pounding on the door right after he was out of sight, to try and warn us there was a scary dude in there with us. We were in there for about 5 minutes with this guy, and never saw him. He had to have heard us and hid somewhere. We started to walk back to our car in the Fred Meyer's parking lot, about 100 yards away, and a car pulled into the parking lot and shined its headlights on us, before flashing its red and blues. The police officers had us all sit down in front of the spotlight in front of the car and asked us what we were doing. We told him we were going to head inside the movie theater, but a really scary tall guy walked in and we chickened out. He told us it was really dangerous to go into places like that, as there had been violence in that building before, and it'd be a shame if we were going to be hurt doing something stupid. He let us go when we drove off, and we saw him shining a light inside the front entrance. We took the nice police officer's advice and never went into places like that again. I never did find out what violence he was talking about. It could have just been a tactic to scare us out of coming back. But regardless, we stuck to graveyards and cemeteries after this. Better to be safe than sorry after all. I work in maintenance in a hospital, but this story comes from out of work hours. Back in November, my grandfather passed away. He had been living in a care home for several years now, and as we were from a smaller city, his main care aide was actually an ex's mother who I am still close to. Nearing his final days, she texted me that things weren't looking good, and to get my mum, who works out of town, and myself, to see him ASAP. The next 2 nights were exhaustive. Her and I barely left his bedside. We were wetting his lips, rubbing his head, and singing Charlie Pride, and telling him stories from my childhood and from my mum's. At one point, Is Anybody Going to San Antonio comes on the CD player, and Mum tears up, talking about how this song reminds her of her father the most. He wasn't really coherent besides a glimmering moment in the first day we got there, and by the final day we were sitting watching the breaths turn to choke breaths. As the hours got nearer, my ex's mum was contacted and came in on her day off to sit with us for that final hour. My mum had her father's head in her lap, and we still had Charlie Pride on the radio. She was whispering in her ear to stop being stubborn, and that she could take care of her brothers, and that she had me to take care of her. The gaps got longer and longer in his breaths. My ex's mum was sitting next to me, the CD player behind us, and my mum laying on the opposite side of the care home bed. All of a sudden his breathing stops, and in that moment so did the CD player. It hadn't skipped once the whole weekend. My mum figured Tyrene had turned it off, starting to sob, assuming it was to signify he was officially gone. I sat and looked at Tyrene like, did that just happen? And after a good 20 seconds out of nowhere he took a shuddery breath, and the CD scrambled forward, and the song just before Is Anyone Going to San Antonio, not sure if that's the name of the song, but it was about not wanting to miss someone, started playing. And then he was gone by the end of San Antonio, the song that Mum remembered him most by. Tyrene mentioned odd things happen more often than not as a person finally passes. I have been working as a guard for a few months at one site, and I've noticed a series of odd occurrences since my first day. The layout of my patrol is a 2-part office building. One side is the north side, using only the first floor for offices, the second floor and the first floor for storage for space, chairs and cubicle walls. The other side, south side, is abandoned, when the company housed in that section moved to a new location, both floors being filled with cubicles, chairs, desks and posters dating from 2013. No files or personal property are in the south section, but the lights don't work properly due to weather damage in 2016. When I started, I patrolled the bottom of the north offices, which is mostly barren aside from a tornado shelter, cubicle walls stored against a wall, and the janitor supply room. Down on this floor, I have felt my jacket grabbed more than once while checking the area. The second floor with the office is more active than the bottom floor. The chairs move and roll into the hallway, and the sound of filing cabinets slams shut. But when I check to see if anyone is around, I find some half-open papers on the floor. The south building is the worst one. The first day I did a patrol, I had chairs, not desk one with wheels, move positions more than once. And while I'd like to blame my co-workers, only 2 people have keycards to that building: security and maintenance. And when I'm on the top floor, I've heard office doors slam shut, and when I investigate to find the doors, I will routinely hear footsteps upstairs. My co-workers have claimed to hear voices and seen shadows, and the closest thing I've had happen besides the sound was a flashlight. New batteries that I replaced the day before constantly flickering on the bottom floor of the south building and returning to normal once I leave. Now I will be trying to investigate again. I want to take a digital recorder and see what happens. Or do you think it was just a hardware issue? I'm going to make sure that I find out. Today, me and my 2 friends went up on the mountain behind my house, up to an abandoned mine. We went up to play airsoft, so we had a bunch of airsoft rifles. It was foggy and drizzling, but we didn't think about it. Anyway, at 4:50 we were starting to leave. By this time, it was almost dark out, and there was a very heavy fog setting all around us. We were just messing about by the old abandoned bucket crane when my friend Connor says that he sees a figure looming towards us in the fog. We thought it might have been a cop or some crackhead, so naturally we started hustling to leave. But the figure seemed off. It looked big and burly, and seemed to move towards us at a relatively quick pace. I should mention that the fire siren from the neighboring town started going off, and the forest goes dead quiet. So Connor yelled out to it, to receive no response. I swear I saw a dog-like creature, but my friend says he saw a person. We took off down the old gravel road, just down the bend, so we were out of sight off the thing, and ducked into the woods, down about a 10 or 12 foot tall hill. We got 500 feet away from the road when we stopped to see if we were being followed. I saw behind some trees at about my 11 o'clock a figure that seemingly ducked behind the tree. My friend said things were moving to my 1 o'clock. They said they heard screaming almost like a wailing. I, however, heard a dog's bark. We slowly started back and eventually got to an ATV trail, where we found a path down to the street. We sprinted down the path, and eventually hit the road where my friend said it was following us to the road, where once we were a block away, through the fog and in the middle of the road, I saw the dog sitting, looking at us, but my friends claimed to have again seen a person. My question is, what the hell was that? A skinwalker, perhaps? We live in eastern Pennsylvania, so I think that's unlikely. Any suggestions as to what it could be? would be appreciated. This was in late November of 2012, and I was doing an install in a winery in North Carolina. It was a long day because we were working out of town, so we worked late to get it finished in one day. I started driving home around midnight and had about a 3-hour drive back home to Oakland. It's 1:30 in the morning. I'm outside of Stockton, and I see this girl standing on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere. She's wearing a little white dress that ends about 3 inches above her knees and is barefoot. She has long black hair flowing down her shoulders, and she is just standing still as a statue. I looked at her as I drove by, but she didn't move. Didn't acknowledge my loud truck as it passed or anything. I was pretty freaked out because you always hear stories like this, and then she just appears in your vehicle with you. But that wasn't the case. She just stood there in the night. The thing that was most weird to me was that it was cold that night, in the low 40s, as well as drizzling a fair bit. And she was wearing a short dress and had no shoes standing on the asphalt. If this was just some girl who does this for fun to freak people out, I feel like she would have been extremely cold and would have been shivering. But this girl did not move. Now, after I got home, I was thinking about it, and I searched "Ghost Girl outside of Stockton," and I found a bunch of articles and stories about the East 8 Mile Road Ghost Girl, and most of the descriptions fit what I saw to a T. I never went back to the area because I moved to another state shortly after, but I want to travel back there to see what I can find one day. Has anyone else seen this girl in that area? Or has anyone else seen a ghost girl in general on the side of a road like this one? Any info would be appreciated. My grandparents own about 600 acres in East Texas, about 15 minutes down a long dirt road. So, basically, out in the middle of nowhere. The land has been used mainly for cattle ranching for the past 4 generations, and if you walk the land long enough, you'll find little remnants of the past in various areas, all the way back to the 1800s, like a single dilapidated brick well amongst tall woods, about a third of a chimney, and an old general store, unrecognizable in the grown-up woods around it. In fact, I swear it's going to fall down any day now, because all that's holding it up are the trees around it, and it's leaning like nobody's business. In the middle of the land, we've built up a simple cabin with a long porch on the back, overlooking a decent-sized pond, roughly 20 acres. The first couple of stories come from my dad and his family. 3 sisters and his mum and dad, who lived about 15 miles from the ranch. One night, they were coming home from Wednesday night Bible class. The newspaper had little snippets of people seeing an unidentified flying object in the sky, but everyone wrote them off as crazy backcountry people with nothing better to do. So they're in the truck discussing these articles, and my dad jokingly points up to a light in the sky high above them, saying that it must be another UFO. As they're watching it though, it starts to get closer and closer, and eventually, I kid you not, lands in the middle of the road. They come to a dead stop, with this thing in front of them. These are devout Christians. They swear up and down that it really happened. It's nighttime, so all they can see are lights spaced around a circular object that's occupying the entire road. The only thing they hear from this thing is a light hum. The entire time, my aunts are screaming and begging my grandpa to turn around and go back into town, but he's stubborn and refuses. Eventually, the thing lifts off the road and hovers above the trees next to them. My grandpa takes off, going 100 miles an hour down the road towards the house, with this thing keeping up with them to their right side. Eventually, to their relief, it flies away. A few minutes later, they are pulling into their driveway to see that the UFO had landed in their back pasture 200 yards away. My grandpa runs into the house, grabs a shotgun, and by the time he gets back out, it flies away for good. I'm not saying that this was an alien or anything. It could have well been government, but they knew exactly where they lived and wanted to mess with them. A year later, my dad and his brother-in-law are raccoon hunting at night. At the ranch in the 20 acres where the pond was later placed. As they were walking, they heard something large crunching the leaves along the side of them. They'd shine the light where they heard the noise, and would then hear it in the opposite side. Again, they'd shine the light towards the sound, and it would immediately be on the other side of them. This happened countless times, so they eventually stood back to back and shined 2 flashlights at the same time in order to catch a glimpse of it. Even though they could never actually see what it was, they could hear it running around in circles. They ended up trying as best they could to ignore it. All the while, this thing continues to walk beside them and running around them in circles. I was about 17 for this next story. My dad and I would spend weekends down at the cabin hunting and fishing, and would sleep in a room that had a window between the head of the 2 beds looking out onto the porch. This one particular night, I woke up at around 3:30 a.m. to the sound of someone running and walking the length of the porch, which was around 20 yards long. Eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. I could hear that A, it did not have shoes, and B, it did not have more than 2 legs, and C, it was large enough to make a loud thud per step. For about 10 minutes, I'm listening to this thing sprint across the back porch, and then walk a few steps, followed by more sprinting. The scared, little about to be poop my pants 17-year-old girl I was, just could not bring myself to turn around and look out the window to see who the heck that was. I guess part of me was terrified it would be like a scene from the Twilight Zone movie, where the thing is ripping out an engine from a plane's wing and then suddenly appears at the passenger window staring at Jeff Daniels, teeth barred, with drool hanging out of its mouth. Eventually the sound wakes up my dad, who was snoring loudly at the time. As soon as this thing on the porch senses my dad's lack of snoring, it quits. Never heard it again after that. Half a year later, my dad is out at the cabin alone. He's sighting in his new gun's laser sight. I know, obnoxious. He's doing this from the porch, and something chucks a rock at him, just barely missing him. He shines a light towards the direction it was thrown from, and nothing. Just a field of grass. Nothing visible that could have thrown that at him, and he quickly went back inside. Last time I was there, a couple of friends and I were sitting in the living room and heard a series of 3 loud knocks, 3 different times on the various areas of the side of the cabin. Remember, this place is in the middle of nowhere, with no one around it for miles. I'm pretty sure I will never stay there alone. This all went down during the spring break of my junior year of high school. My school was in a pretty small Iowa town, with a district spanning several smaller hamlets. During the summer of 2014, a few friends of mine put together a film club that would make short films and compete in national film festivals against other schools. We were a pretty small group and found it kind of difficult to get together for any actual filming until spring break of 2015, when we made plans for a little excursion. 4 of us ended up going on the trip, myself and 3 members of the club, Jake, Bill, and Kyle. We ended up choosing to go camping out at Mossy Glen Hollow, a supposedly haunted state park up in northeastern Iowa. Since the 1850s, there have been several murders and suicides out at Mossy Glen, including a few decapitations and a hired hitman in the 1930s. Being the edgy teens that we were, we jumped at the chance to go hiking and camping somewhere like that. It was within 15 minutes of a small town, so stocking up on food wouldn't be that big of an issue either. So, all lights green. We load up 2 of our sedans, programmed the GPS, and off we were for a spring break, camping in some haunted woods. After the first hour and a half on the road, a few red flags began to fly. After the last large town before getting way out in the boondocks, my phone's data signal cut out, and the GPS randomly changed directions on us. Since none of us had any idea where the hell we were at, or where Mossy Glen was supposed to be, we didn't have much choice but to blindly follow the new route. Here's a little something about Iowa land distribution, especially up north, because the hills can get so uneven at places. You end up with portions of land that are too steep or too rocky to farm, or small flat basins that are surrounded by steep slopes that it makes farming incredibly difficult. Over the course of several decades, you end up with farms buying a plot of farmland with patches of unworkable land stuck in between. Rather than buy this land and pay property tax on it for several centuries, as these farms stay in the family for generations, the land either remains unpurchased and public, repurchased by the state, or donated to the state or DNR. Many of these plots get designated as state parks or preserves surrounded by private property, such as soon as we found out Mossy Glen Hollow. This explains the private property signs we saw by the lake, which was land purchased right next to the unusable boulder-covered creek. This is a bit important for the sake of the story, and now that you understand it, we will dive back in there. Once we're firmly in the middle of nowhere, our GPS took us off the paved highways and onto gravel roads. At this point, you typically would see the usual brown Iowa DNR signs, designating that you were near a state park, but there were none. There weren't even any tree clumps to indicate that you were near some sort of forest. Red flag number 2. Another 10 minutes or so into the drive, and the gravel road soon turns into a dirt road, then a low maintenance road, then a Class B minimum maintenance road, with Iowa's dedication to road preservation. This basically means that somebody probably came by and took a peek in the 90s, and promptly forgot about its existence. As we came around the last hilly bend that the GPS shows on our route, we see a farmhouse with a large machine shed with no lights or activity around either, and no cars in the driveway. A bit weirded out that a house would be right next to a state park, we slow down and keep rolling. To our dismay, however, the road dissolves into a mess of washed tractor tire gouges from last fall's harvest. We stop the cars as far down as we can pass without getting hung up on a frozen rut and unpack some of our equipment. The road gradually narrows, snakes down the middle of a field, and turns down into the small but very thick clump of woods at the bottom of a wide ravine. We get out and hike down the gradually steepening slope and take in the scenery. At first, everything looks like a pretty damn cool set to film at. There are several lime outcrops hanging off the hillside, a footpath with some picturesque tree overhang, and even a few birds out that made an unseasonal return from wintering down south. We can all hear some water running, but can't identify a source from the trail. Looking off in any direction, all that we see was a seemingly endless sea of trees. At the bottom of the hill was a small pond, in the middle of a grassy clearing with a fence. As we approached the fence, we noticed a sign, "Private property, keep out." Bill checks his watch and realizes it's almost time for dinner. So we trek back to our vehicles and hook up the GPS. The nearest town over was a little place called Edgewood that had several diners and a gas station to load up on supplies for the week. We brought some canned food, but not much beyond that. As we got to town, we realized that Edgewood was a lot smaller than we had expected. Less than 900 people, it would turn out. Everyone knows everyone in these small towns, so we got several weird looks when 4 strangers rolled up with plates from the other side of the state. Kyle thought to ask the cashier and a few people at the gas station about Mossy Glen Hollow, and why the only route in was through some dude's field on a busted out dirt road. To our surprise, nobody had even heard of a place called Mossy Glen, nor could they figure out why the hell 4 high schoolers suddenly rolled into town looking for the place. Red flag number 3. We shrug it off as just a few crazy locals and take off back down the dirt trail. As we round the corner back near the farmhouse, we notice all the lights are off and nobody seems to be home. I suggest that we leave some sort of note on the house door that we're going to be parking on the side of the road near their place, just to be safe. It's starting to get late in the day, and being this far out in the country, it wouldn't be unheard of to come face to face with a shotgun when the homeowner finds our cars, since the road is impassable from that point onwards. Parking there wouldn't realistically block anyone off the road and would still technically be on public land. We hike back down the wooded trail and start scouting for a place to set up camp for the night, making sure to be on the public side of the fenced pond area. We discover that the sea of trees that we saw earlier was actually quite a bit thinner when seen from below. In fact, the dirt path led to a decently sized clearing with a creek and small waterfall cutting through the limestone deposits. None of us could believe that we had missed such a thing a few hours earlier. When Bill comes to a realization, he disappears around the corner, back into the trees, and emerges at the top of the trail a few minutes later. Though we could plainly see him, the trees lined up just right so that he could not see anything beyond the rocks below the path ledge. Continuing further up the creek, we noticed that there are conveniently placed rocks, about the perfect distance apart to step without disturbing the water or surrounding rocks. One could walk almost silently up and down the creek, while the sound of the water masked the steps. Not thinking much of it, we take some pictures of the large moss-covered boulders, and get some pretty nice scenic shots. We find a place to make camp and everything is going great until we approach the waterfall. Just before the waterfall sat a clearing without any large boulders or rocks, and an odd arrangement of logs. One sat horizontal, supported at each end by two piles of rocks. In front sat a crude stone circle with a pile of burnt logs inside, a fire pit with a bench. Though a bit of a surprise at first, we shrug it off as some weekend project that the people up at the house put together. After all, with such a cool place just a short walk from home, why not? I have a similar fire pit set up at home, so I'm not overly concerned. Hey, what the hell is this? Kyle yells it from a boulder a few yards ahead. On it sat a blaze orange beanie, a single gardening glove, and an empty can of beer. Oh, and a stick of deodorant that had seen some serious wear. Looking closer at the beer can, we realized that it must have been opened fairly recently. Foam is still fresh in the bottom of the can, and it had a fumy smell. Bewildered by what the hell we just found, Jake starts looking around the other side of the boulders upstream of the items. "Holy shit, there's a cave!" he shouts back to us. Later he told us the cave was large enough to comfortably fit a person inside, and that, more disturbingly, he saw some red fabric inside as well. Before he can get a good look around, Kyle calls the three of us back over, with a sense of urgency. He speaks very quietly to us and indicates that we shouldn't shout back. "Shampoo," he whispers, pointing urgently down at his feet. Sure enough, in the mud and leaves, there's a blue bottle of Suave shampoo right next to the creek. At this point, we're all adequately freaked out and ready to call our little soiree quits. Bill remains pretty sure that this is just junk left behind by the people at the house after a weekend and a few too many bush lights. But things don't just add up to me. There's one detail that I've been leaving out at this point. The day before, this part of Iowa got some heavy rain, which contributed to the mud situation on the dirt road and on the trail. With the combination of wind and rain, the items on the rocks would have shown some signs of being wet, if not, then displaced entirely. Also, the air was pretty cold, as it is every year around this time, not getting above the mid-40s for the whole week. Then everything starts to click for me. Whoever drank the beer and left the shampoo, hat, glove, deodorant must have done this sometime this morning. The fire pit also had fresh char marks on the rocks, and the wood had not been wet for a while, meaning it must have been lit last night at the earliest. The small cave would have provided enough shelter from the rain to stay dry, without the freezing temperatures all through the day. Whoever was using shampoo out here must have had little other choice to do so. If it was the homeowners, they would have had to be seriously masochistic to bathe in the shallow, freezing, rocky creek rather than at home. If it wasn't, then we likely weren't alone right now. Whoever left these things out left in a hurry, and if they were here 4 hours ago, they would have been able to see us on the trail cliff long before we even knew they were down here. Remembering the arrangements of rocks on the stream, they could have even been leaving their camp just as we were coming down the dirt trail. As I processed this, I started to look around at my surroundings and realized that the small area was bordered by the thick trees on the trail side, several sets of huge boulders on the pond side, and limestone cliffs everywhere else. Due to the tree, rock, and hill cover, you could light a fire in the pit at night, and no one around you would even know. The illusion of being able to see up the dirt trail from the camp, but not down, played in reverse from the cliffs. If you were wearing brown or green, you could easily see down from the rocks on top of the camp below, while blending in with the trees above. Coming to these realizations, I noticed something else. Something more sinister. The birds and small animals that were previously heard are now quiet, aside from the soft babble of the creek. The entire place is completely silent. As I start to explain this to the rest of the group, I see the wheels turning in their heads as well. Jake starts to head back to the small cave, when a rustling up on the limestone ridge catches our attention. Something large was shifting around up there, something that apparently didn't want Jake to see what was in the cave. We all look up at whatever or whoever made the noise as it started shuffling down the ridge towards the makeshift camp. Because of the high cliff, the only way down to us would be going all the way back down to the pond and then double back up the stream. Realizing this and almost crapping ourselves at how open we were, we book it back down the stream, up the dirt path across the field, and back to our cars. On the drive back to Edgewood, we all try and process what the hell just happened. I take a look at a satellite map, and the only really accessible way to the cliff where we heard the noise would be to walk up there from the pond. It was too craggy to approach from the adjacent field to the east. Whatever made that noise would have been large, and a deer getting up there wouldn't necessarily be out of the question, but I doubt it. It would have had to have been some incredible timing to have started moving around just as Jake began looking at the cave, and whatever red fabric was inside. Kyle found a report of an escaped convict from a local prison a few weeks ago, and was convinced that it was his camp that we found, though we were all doubtful at best of this idea. To satisfy his concerns, we'd agreed to report the strange thing we found to the police, anonymously, since we all really wanted to get home at this point. None of us followed up with them, and I doubt anything came of it. The small, close-knit town police department gets a report of strange sightings for some stranger the same day that 4 high schoolers roll up and park outside a farmer's house for a few hours and then book it out. Doesn't exactly spell high-threat criminal activity to me. Still, things still just don't seem to add up. Whoever came running down that cliff, if indeed it was a who, wanted to keep whatever was inside that cave hidden, but not enough to actually fight 4 decently tall and able teenagers. We figured he just wanted to scare us off, since the noises seemed to stop once we reached the dirt path. I thought it odd that someone living out in the woods with something seemingly to hide would set up shop in a state park. That is until I checked my GPS again. That little reroute that it took us on was an old entrance to the park that had been cut off by the purchase of the lake area, sometime between the map records used for Google's navigation being updated and that day. The current entrance to the park is about 2 miles north of where the GPS sent us, thinking it was a faster route. The place we were at was still public land for sure, but not quite what we pictured. So dude in Mossy Glen Hollow, let's not meet again. I come from a military family, and as such, I lived all over the country, often unable to keep friends for any period. I also have insane social anxiety, so I'm overall pretty bad at making friends to begin with. This story starts after I lived in rural Newfoundland for about 3 years, at age 14. I have no friends. My home life is pretty terrible, and I was at this point pretty depressed. I lived on about an acre of land, with a river separating us from about 1,000,000 acres of raw forest that had a bunch of ATV trails in it. It was a spooky forest, and I have tons of stories about what I saw in there that makes most horror movies look like a joke. Of note is the Bear Trap Forest, the 40-foot swamp, the random abandoned suburb, and the house in the middle of nowhere. But these are tales for another time. It was around late August. My parents had told me for many weeks now there had been hoots and hollers coming from our backyard. They had seen flashlights and thought it was just some kids trying to break into our garage and steal some beer. There had been times, and I'd heard it too, normally in the evening, of just a couple of voices periodically hollering, and often I heard several voices speaking from just across the river in the woods. No big deal. A lot of kids hung out in those woods, and due to my oppressive social anxiety, I sure as hell didn't have any desire to talk to them. After this happened for some weeks, I heard the kids doing their usual thing around 4 in the afternoon, and decided, you know what? I'm gonna see what's so amusing. So I ventured into the woods, and go maybe about 300 feet in an ATV trail my neighbor used, and I met one of them. I'm going to use their names, as it will give some context. The kid I met was called Jack. He was a year or two younger than me, about a foot shorter and wearing some really out-of-date clothes. He seemed kind of surprised to meet me, but we said our hellos. I said I had heard them for a while now, and came to see what was happening. Jack got super pumped and insisted I follow him to his friend's project. So I follow the guy, and I'm taken into an area that is pretty clear-cut, in a dense path of woods. I knew this area. I hung out in the woods alone a lot, and explored, and this was brand new. There were 2 other kids there, one my age named Elvis, and another older kid by about 2 years called Louis. They said they were working on a treehouse/fort, and wondered if I would be interested in helping. I of course said yes. I had never been asked to hang out with anyone, and they showed me around. Now, I need to discuss these kids' clothes. When I say out of style, I'm talking early 80s miserable fashion. Neon colors, one kid had shoulder pads, and was a mess. They wore big rubber boots, and the kids looked, I want to say, new, like they had no signs of pimples. Their hair was immaculate, their clothes crisp as hell. I had just assumed they were hand-me-downs from their parents or something, as they stated that they were all friends, not brothers. So these kids were nice to me, and I mean really nice. I never really got to know them. They never wanted to talk about their home life, but that isn't surprising where I lived. We used hatchets, saws, ropes, and nails to make a pretty solid fort. Had about 8-foot walls made of birch trees, and we made a table to sit at. A lookout post in the biggest tree that we could find. The place was about the size of a 1-bedroom apartment, and we were all pretty proud. One day, we were sitting at the table, talking about our favorite trees or something, and I asked Elvis why I'd never seen him around before. If he lived near me, he had to go to my school. It was one of 2 schools in the town, and no way he lived in the catchment area of the other one. He insisted he did, and wondered why he'd never met me either. We didn't know the same classmates, same people, and could barely agree on teachers. But whatever. These kids talked to me, and that was enough. So about 2 weeks after meeting them and building this fort, on one of these days I said I needed to go home and get something to eat. I asked if they wanted something too, as this was basically my backyard and my parents always made way too much food. They became downright hostile. Not over the food, they just refused to cross the river, adamantly. Louis came up with a story about how crossing a stranger's river is bad luck, but I sure wasn't pushing the issue. I asked if they wanted something, and they said yes, and I brought back a pie that we could all eat. They apologized about getting angry, said they were just very superstitious, and I thought nothing more of it. We had a good rest of the day planning to invade the woods looking for some thick pine trees. Cut to about a week later. I had went to the fort and we did our thing, but today the kids looked haggard. Jack was particularly bad. He looked like he had just gotten the beat down of his life while catching pneumonia 3 times over. I asked if he was okay. He said he just had flu. But they also looked wet, maybe greasy is a better word. They had sick hair. Their skin was all shiny and clammy, and their clothes looked like arse. I wasn't shocked. These kids wore the same clothes pretty much every day, but so did a lot of the really poor kids in town. We played around for an hour or so before they left, with Louis saying he would see me tomorrow, as Jack and Elvis walked away coughing like they'd smoked a pack a day. I had told my parents about these kids. They thought they were weird, but a kid with no friend just found 3, so don't ask questions. The nighttime hollering had stopped at this point, and we never did see the flashlights again. So the next day I went back with a hatchet, a bag of nails in hand, as the plan was that we were going to give the lookout a roof. When I come to the fort, the place is wrecked. The walls had been torn down. The table was in half, and the lookout had maybe 1 or 2 pieces left to it. Most notably, everything was rotting, like it had been sitting there for decades, rotting. The table was basically nothing, and I could see growth in what had been our floor. Solid, half-tree growth. My only thought was, what the hell? And I rationalized that maybe someone found out about the fort and wrecked it. So I waited for the kids to come. Next day, and the next day, and the day after that. I waited a week but never did see those kids again. I was pretty dejected, and eventually I stopped trying to wait for them. I wanted to look for them, but they had never shown me or told me where they lived, other than up the hill. My parents noticed and asked me why I wasn't hanging out with the kids anymore. I told them what was happening, and they dismissed it and just insisted that they probably didn't want to be my friend, that I didn't need them. I was sad for a good while after that. Cut to today. I'm 29, and telling my wife about these kids I used to hang out with. And this time, we made a call forward. I explain how they look, how they acted, and it's overall a pretty good memory with a sad ending. My wife looks at me wide-eyed and said, "You hang out with a bunch of spooky ghost kids." I find this crazy, but she says, "Did anyone else see them?" And no, they didn't. They saw a flashlight, but not the kids. They heard them, and they heard about them, but no one had ever laid an eye on them other than me. There were never any records I could find about them. No one else in the school they supposedly went to knew them, and they never showed me their house or came to mind despite my insistence. My wife said it was some spooky stuff, and that I should probably share it with all of you. What do you guys think? I was on a weekend getaway with my girlfriend. We rented a cabin on Airbnb. It was very secluded and charming, nestled at the top of a hill in the forest. We liked to cook together, so we brought a bunch of groceries that we picked up on our ride out to the woods. The grocery store had a section of loose candy sold by weight, and we filled a few bags. One bag had caramels, another had chocolate-covered cherries. The first night we made a big dinner, snacking on the caramels as we cooked. When it came time for dessert, we considered opening the bag of cherries, which was still twist-tied and untouched. They looked pretty, tessellated in neat rows there behind the crinkly plastic. But we felt lazy and kept with the caramels, eating a few and then climbing into bed with sticky teeth. The next morning, we woke up to find the bag of cherries standing on the counter right where we'd left it, but completely empty. The little gold twist tie lay next to it, unfurled. Everything looked like it had been handled carefully, as the bag was free of wrinkles, and we couldn't find a single cherry anywhere. We spent the better part of the day convincing each other that neither of us was pranking the other, and that neither had eaten them all that night, but was too embarrassed to admit it. We still reminisce about this and trade theories. We don't think it was an animal, because even something as dexterous as a raccoon would have certainly left a cherry or two out of place. Our best guess still gives me chills. Maybe someone was living in the basement of this vacation home, listening to us the whole time. This story happened to my sister-in-law 4 years ago. They are uber religious, and the state of her mental stability, on top of a finger found and a police follow-up, makes this story 100% true and searchable. Last July, my sister-in-law Jackie was going back to Boise to visit for the weekend. Her husband lives in Provo and is going to law school there, as he's just graduated from a BYU chapter somewhere in southern Idaho. I'm not from Idaho, and I'm not Mormon, so I don't remember where it's located. Anyway, Jackie decided to drive from Provo, Utah, and head up to BYU to say hello to her friends just before coming back to Boise. The route she was on was I-15, which forks off into I-84 up to Boise. After you pass through Salt Lake City, the route becomes lost in a plain rolling flat of miscellaneous desert dotted by farmland here and there. Jackie left Provo, Utah in the evening, as she planned on making dinner for her husband before her departure. She ended up leaving around 11 p.m., and given the late time, she decided to forego visiting her friends at the BYU chapter, and headed along I-84 to come straight to Boise. She was in between Tremonton, Utah, and Burley, Idaho, in the literal middle of nowhere, where she drove up to what looked like a body lying in the road. The location is so desolate, there are no radio channels, cell phone services, or lights to be seen for hours. This 24-year-old girl was in the middle of the desert, in a green Dodge car that already had enough problems, so it's a miracle she made it home to us without issue to begin with. She arrived at my wife's parents' house, but that was just the beginning of the story, really. Here is her account of what led to these events. At 2 a.m., she said she saw something lying on the road in the distance. As she approached it, she could see it was a body, lifeless, in the middle of nowhere. It stretched across both lanes, and she could not simply pass without running it over. Cautiously, she came to a stop and made sure she parked about 15 yards away and stopped. She opened the door and yelled, "Are you all right?" But no response could be heard. With the car lights broadcasting brightly on the body in the road, she got out of her car and slowly walked towards the person. As she got about 10 feet from the body in the road, she could see it was a dummy, fully dressed in human clothes, just lying there. Terrified, she sprinted back to her car, slammed on the door, and sped over the dummy. We received the cell phone call from her around Mountain Home, 45 minutes away from Boise. She was shaken and terribly scared, claiming she could hear footsteps chasing her to her car before she got in and drove off. We wrote it off as a freak accident, as we were all asleep and sounded too bizarre to worry of anything. As she pulled into the subdivision, she called us once again to help her unload the car and, probably, console given the bizarre experience. I opened the garage door and stood in the driveway with my wife, waiting for her to pull in. She came racing into the driveway and jumped out of the car, and this is where I lost it. As she opened the car door, a finger fell out. She had not stopped and drove straight to us after she came across the dummy. The person who had placed the dummy had chased her back to her car, and as she slammed the door and sped off, the person had reached out, losing a finger in the slammed door. We immediately called the police in the area, where she said she stopped at. The cops did a survey of all the hospitals in the area for a man missing a finger, and they found an exact match of his description. He was still in the hospital as he was arrested. The police did not give any details into the man's past or who he was, just simply told us to not worry about him, as he'd been arrested. I'm sure it's an anticlimactic ending to a terrifying scenario, but I will never forget the feeling that came over me when the finger fell out of her car door. I always drive with a firearm in my vehicle now, any time I need to travel. In the year 2000, when I was 10 years old, my parents sent me to a 5-day summer camp in Huntsville, Ontario. This camp was definitely a Bible camp, and being raised without religion, I felt uncomfortable there. But I got along well with my peers. Me and 7 other girls were staying in the room on the far right, and there were 3 other rooms on the main floor, and upstairs is where the camp counselors bunked. The main floor had a very high ceiling, and near the top was a small square door which attached to where the camp counselors were staying. I was staying along the right wall on the bottom bunk. On the 3rd night, me and my bunkmate were having a blast, just talking and telling jokes. But our camp counselor opened the little door at the top of the room and told us to be quiet, so we all went to bed. Out of nowhere I hear Brianna yelling, "Cat, wake up now!" And being the light sleeper I was, I immediately woke up. I didn't know how long I had slept for. I then heard Angel say, "Cat, look over to the bunk in front of you." I was facing the wall, so I turn around and am met with a black figure with long curly hair sitting on the ladder leading up to the top bunk on the bed in front of mine. The moonlight illuminated the entire room, and this figure was completely opaque, shaking her long curly hair. I looked around the room and noticed all of the girls were all accounted for and definitely awake. I stared at this thing for what seemed like an eternity. Every one of the girls were in complete hysterics and crying, but I was dead silent. I couldn't make a peep. I was completely terrified to the point I couldn't blink or even move. I mean, what could I have done? This thing was sitting there right before my eyes. Then this figure stands up and jumps off the ladder and just stood at the edge of the bed for a moment. All of the girls scream, "Cat, get out of there now!" To which the figure moved around in an almost robotic way and started walking towards me. I finally then find the nerve to book it out of the bottom bunk and run to the other side of the room. I run up to Brianna and Angel's bunk and climb the ladder as quickly as I could. At this point I started becoming hysterical and crying like the rest of them. The figure was still standing near my bed. Angel and I started hugging, and I was too afraid to even open my eyes after what I'd seen. Angel decides to jump down off the bunk, switch the light on, and just like that, the figure was gone. I guess we made a lot of noise, and the camp counselor opened the little door and told us to keep it down. We told her what we'd seen, and she came downstairs to investigate. She came into the room and told us, "There's nothing here. Your mind was probably playing tricks on you. Now back to bed." All of the girls, including myself, were still pretty upset and scared, and just sat up in our bunks talking about what we'd seen. 5 minutes after, we hear screaming coming from the room directly across the hall from us. We all started crying again, and the camp counselors opened the little door and told us, "See what you've started? You have everyone in the cabin scared." The camp counselor went to investigate, and we turned on the lights in our room and opened the door. We hear one of the girls in the room across from us say while crying, "Something lifted our bunk. Please don't make us stay in there. It's going to kill us." To which the counselor sternly responded with, "That's impossible. Now quiet down and go to bed. This is the final time I'll say this." After 20 minutes of talking quietly, we all went to bed. Nothing else strange happened during the duration of the camp trip, and I had exchanged phone numbers with the girls. About a week after the camp trip had ended, I contacted both Angel and Brianna and asked them if they remembered that night, and they both said they did, and they said they'd never forget it. This was the very first experience I had with the paranormal. After the Bible camp incident, I had no more paranormal events. Until I was 14, that is. When these occurrences started, I would mostly just hear strange stuff, like someone scratching the walls outside my bedroom, screaming and growling, and footsteps, and sometimes what sounded like footsteps with long toenails dragging along the floor. Very creepy laughs that sounded like it came from someone with an incredibly deep voice, and occasionally something whispering my name into my ear. These noises used to be confined to outside my bedroom, but after a while, they'd always lead into my room. Very rarely would I ever see anything. It was mostly just audio. When I did see something, it was mainly a tall black hooded figure, either standing in my doorway or the foot of my bed. Sometimes I would feel something trying to grab my foot, or something running its fingers through my hair, which caused me to always keep the end of my blanket tucked under my feet for years. These occurrences would generally last all night until sunrise, but its peak hours were between 1 and 4 a.m. Sometimes things would occur even during the day. At age 14 one night, I was awoken by shuffling and noise coming from my dresser area. I'm a light sleeper. Any noise will wake me. And when I looked at my dresser, I saw a very tall hooded man, pitch black, going through my panty drawer. Even though I was completely terrified, I got the nerve to sit up in bed. The figure then turned completely around and acknowledged me in the room by staring at me for a few seconds before vanishing. For some reason I had no idea why, but I fell asleep after that with no problem at all. When I awoke in the morning, one of my pairs of bras were missing, as well as some of my underwear on the floor. Fast forward a few weeks, I was downstairs in the basement doing laundry and saw something hanging from a rusty nail on a support beam. And sure enough, it had been the bra that was missing. My mum's best friend Denise was over a few days ago to go blueberry picking with my mother during the summer. Denise brought with her about 20 packages of cosmetic removal wipes, which we put on the top of the towel cupboard outside the bathroom door. My mum decided she'd go grocery shopping with my dad to get food for supper, which left Denise and I in the house alone. Knowing that Denise was also sensitive to the paranormal, I began telling her about what had been happening in the house and what I had experienced. We decided to get up off the couch and walk towards my kitchen, and then we see our locked front door unlock itself and open without any force. Wide-eyed, we both look at each other. "Did you see that?" she said. I then walked to lock the front door. This incident got Denise pretty shaken up, and later on in the night I was lying in bed and started to hear a crinkly sound. The crinkly noise continued for a few minutes, and it dawned on me that it was someone playing with the packages of makeup removal wipes on the top of the cupboard. All of a sudden, they all fall down onto the floor. My mum opens her bedroom door and goes to pick them up because she heard them fall too. It got eerily quiet for about 20 minutes, and then the crinkly sounds start again. All the wipes fell down, and not 5 seconds later, my bed was pushed into the wall really hard with me on it, causing me to scream bloody murder. My mother came running out of her room asking me what was wrong. I was crying and told her what happened, and she told me it was nonsense. I got out of bed, turned on the light, and pushed my bed away from the wall, when I noticed the wall was indented on the right side where the impact hit. I never push my bed right up against the wall. I always have my bed at least an inch away from the wall, because my power outlet is on the left side of my bed. I swear, these are all true. We live in New Jersey, and if you're familiar with the magazine Weird and J, then you'll know all about Clinton Road. For those of you who don't, Clinton Road is a road in West Milford, New Jersey, that's 10 miles of pure dark and winding of road in the middle of the woods, with no streetlights and no houses the entire way. It's considered the most haunted road in America and is a popular spot for teens and young adults to look for a scare. Popular urban legends of the area are ghosts, satanic rituals, and KKK gatherings in the woods, hybrid animals, and a spot where mafia hitman Richard Iceman Kuklinski would dump his bodies. So my friend and I took a trip there one time, and he's driving down the road and he swears he saw a fat guy with his face covered in face paint or makeup in his underwear, walking on the side of the road. Another time he said he found a red phone booth just like the ones in Britain, if not an exact replica, with an ominous purple or dark blue light shining from it. When I was growing up in the 60s on Long Island, I adored my Aunt Elizabeth. She's my dad's baby sister, 12 years younger and 17 years older than me. She was a flight attendant for a major carrier and lived in an apartment in the city with a classic Italian beauty, petite with beautiful olive skin, green eyes, and jet black hair. She doted on me, and I loved the pictures and gifts that she'd bring for me from other parts of the country, and sometimes even Europe. When I got older, my parents would let me go visit her apartment, where she and her equally gorgeous and glamorous friends would smoke cigarettes, drink cocktails, and play records and talk about glamorous and adult things together. And I would feel sophisticated and cool merely by being in the room. one day, when she was 30, she was called in sick to work. Thinking she had the flu, it turned out to be meningitis, and she was dead within 2 days. What followed were the saddest events of my childhood. One of 3 times I saw my father cry, big, racking sobs, was as he was dressing for the wake. I remember Aunt Elizabeth laid out at the wake, wearing her flight attendant uniform, still beautiful. I remember how soft and lovely the cream-colored satin lining her casket felt. So many people came to her funeral that people just spilled out on the sidewalk next to our little suburban Catholic church. Sunday dinners with my grandparents and aunts and uncles never felt the same. Ironically, this niece of a flight attendant from the golden age of air has always been terrified of air travel. I used to travel quite frequently for work, and on some long-haul flights I would be unable to cope without the help from a whole bottle of red wine in Ambien. A few months ago, I decided I want to drop that. It's not exactly healthy. So on my first flight across the country in a while, I took 10 milligrams of melatonin, sat in my seat anxiously, and tried to fall asleep. Eventually I did, and what followed were terrifying dreams. Of course, it would take place on the same flight, and of course the cabin pressure would drop, and of course the plane would be plummeting, and I was about to die crashing into a cornfield. As everyone panicked and screamed, I saw a flight attendant walking down the aisle to my seat, and it was my Aunt Elizabeth. She was walking calmly and intently with a little sly smile on her face, as if I were an old friend of hers who she hadn't seen in a long time. She was wearing the same flight attendant uniform she was buried in, but her legs and feet were bare. She came, looked at me, took my left hand in hers and said, "It'll be okay, honey. It really will. Things can look bad, and sometimes it gets a little turbulent, but the pilot will right it." And then said, "How are you?" I sputtered out the first thing that came to mind if asked, "What have you done with your life since age 13? I think I mentioned where I went to school, and something about my first job, something about cell phones and how much she would have loved them. I said my dad had passed, but my mum and sister were doing fine. I talked about how ridiculous rents were in the city, and about the changes that had happened to our hometown. As I was babbling, I noticed the plane returning to normal, the pressure coming back, people calming down, and the dream ended shortly before everything returned to normality. Aunt Elizabeth's hand on my shoulder. I woke up 30 minutes before landing. I was so stunned by this dream. I hadn't really thought about Aunt Elizabeth or about her in detail for years. I had a few minutes, so I called my mother and told her what happened. I mentioned that I thought it strange that in the dream she was barefoot while working on the plane, and my mother paused and said, "Elizabeth was buried barefoot. Apparently, it's custom in the little corner of Sicily that my father's family comes from for women to be buried barefoot when laid to rest, and they'd adhere to it when burying Aunt Elizabeth and my grandmother many years later. I would not have known, as the lower lid of her casket was closed during the wake. I'm not even religious, but that made me truly believe that my Aunt Elizabeth came to visit me and comfort me during a time of stress and fear, or something like her, a piece of her. It was wonderful and moving to realize this, like a warm blanket around me. I suddenly recalled memories of my aunt that I didn't even know I had. I was in tears in an airport bathroom. I've been through a lot in my life. Some moves, unemployment, 2 divorces, losing a house, and getting one back. friends and family dying. But for a few moments in a dream I got to see someone who I loved and who loved me when I was a little girl, excited for the big world ahead of her. I love you, Aunt Elizabeth. Visit again, anytime. About a year ago, I was out back with my family. It was around 8, and the sun was setting. We lived in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The closest neighbor lived far away, and something down the field kept catching my eye, but I ignored it at first. My sister saw it too, and kept looking out towards the trees. She was getting freaked out about it. My mum said to go investigate, so me and my sister started to walk across the field towards the tree line. Big mistake. It's hard for me to describe. This was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I didn't see it at first, and I didn't understand why my sister was so scared, until we were about 100 yards away, when I saw this creature. Tall, probably 8 to 9 feet tall, white, humanoid with an elongated head, and no face. It had long arms and peeked around the trees. We stopped in our tracks. We couldn't tell what it was. It took a few steps further out of the trees and swayed back and forth, looking at me like a praying mantis. Me and my sister ran screaming back to the house, where my mum stood, jaw dropped. She'd seen it too. I had never been so scared in my life. We grabbed the binoculars and watched this terrifying creature peek in and out of the tree line, spying on us. My grandma thought we all had a wild imagination. The sun was almost gone now, and it was getting really dark, and the darker it got, the more it moved, back and forth along the trees. It was terrifying. So we went in for the night and locked everything up tight. I couldn't sleep that night. I was hearing scratching on the roof, and at one point, a very loud bang, and various noises coming from the barn. I was very afraid that I would wake up to my animals missing. The next morning, my grandma asked if we had heard the loud bangs outside that night. She ended up taking my grandpa with her on her morning walk. I have no idea what it was, and it still haunts me to this day. This is a story of my first encounter with the paranormal that I can remember. I was about 8 or 9 years old, playing with my little cousins at their parents' house during a family gathering. Behind their house is a large forest located in northeast Florida. My cousins, their neighbor, and I were playing hide and seek in the forest, and the only rule their parents had was to stay within sight of the house. Of course, we didn't listen. I was getting bored of the game and wanted to do some exploring. I convinced the other kids to join me as we headed deeper into the forest. I noticed this ball of light floating in midair. I thought I was seeing things. I remember rubbing my eyes to make sure it wasn't in my head, and I asked my cousins if they saw it too, and when I pointed it out, they confirmed it was there. It was bright and bobbed back and forth, changing from a yellowish color to a transparent green hue. We followed it for I can't remember how long, but we reached a small cabin and the orb disappeared. It was dusk at this point, and curiosity got the best of me. My cousins and the neighbor's kid were too scared to go up, but I peeked inside the window and I saw a dim light inside through a window, and what I thought was a human skull sitting on a table next to some jars. Then a shadow from within moved across the far wall. I got chills and signaled the other kids to run back the way we came and took off immediately behind them. We ran as fast as we could and didn't stop until we were inside the house, and I locked the door behind us. I remember getting in trouble because our parents couldn't see us from the kitchen window. I didn't tell my mom or anyone else what I'd seen because I didn't want to scare my cousin or worry my parents. To be frank, I'm not sure if what I saw was even there. Later that night, I woke up to the sound of helicopters and dogs barking outside. It was well past midnight, and I asked my mum, who was standing in the kitchen with the rest of the adults that stayed over after the party that was going on. They all had their eyes glued to whatever was happening in the backyard through the kitchen window. She said they found the body of a woman in the forest and a cabin where her killer was staying, and there was a manhunt going on. I remember being unable to sleep for the rest of the night, and the glaring white lights that shined through the folds of the blinds from the helicopters above. I'm still not sure what that all was. Maybe it was the spirit of the woman who was trying to lead someone to her killer. I'm not even sure if one of the other kids told anyone about the cabin we saw, and if it was one of the parents that called the police. I just remember that we were never allowed to go near the tree line again when we visited after that night. I never wanted to anyway. I'm 24 now, and have had many other experiences since then, but this is one that I actually forgot about and reminded myself of recently while reading up Will-O-Wisps, so I thought I'd share where it all began for me. About 15 years ago, my parents, my brother and I were driving around the countryside looking for a way back to the highway after going to see a house outside of the city. The vegetation is mostly tall grass and dead trees, and the dirt road isn't lit at all, which at night gives the surroundings a kind of eerie feeling. My dad's Nissan Primera, it's making his way through the countless deserted crossroads, and we are lost as hell because there was no GPS back then. As we are arriving at another crossroads, we see there's something in the middle of the road. It looks like a baby carriage. As we get closer, my father slows down on the side of the carriage, and my mother starts shouting. There in the middle of the road is a beat-up baby carriage on its side, and we can hear a baby crying. My mum is going, "My God, the baby, get the baby!" And as she goes to open her door, my dad punches in gear and does one of those movie moves where the car slides a bit and does a gravel kick. He basically wants to haul ass out of there. My mother is still crying and screaming, her door half open, and my brother and I look back just in time to see 4 guys jump out the tall grass on the side of the road, holding planks and baseball bats and other weapons. We eventually find our way to the highway and stop at a gas station right at the entrance. My father tells the gas station attendant what we just saw, and the dude goes, "Oh yeah, those guys. They're always doing that to steal cars and money. They basically put a baby doll in a carriage, and when you stop the car, they jump out the bushes and jack you for all you've got." We never went back to that region after that. Back in primary school, 3rd grade, we had this 3rd grade camp on our school's rugby field on a Friday night. No tents though. We all slept in the clubhouse on the field. It was a lit night. We played games, hide and seek, sang songs, and teased the third grade couples. It was an amazing night, till my group of friends and I went out to hide on the other side of the rugby field, with all the lights turned off. We had 3 flashlights, and being third graders, we were all already in this spooky, scary vibe. We were planning to go hide in the tree, where we spent our breaks during school, but quickly decided otherwise when we saw 2 men. Well, they may have been teenagers, but we were short, and it was quite dark. And ran back to our clubhouse and told the 3 class teachers who were spending the night with us. All us children were called inside the clubhouse for safety and supervision. The male teacher that was with us took a flashlight and went to check if they really were the 2 guys there. And if they were, how? As they must have broken into school, because the only way to get to the field was through the school. We were supposed to close the blinds in order not to see, but I was too curious, so kept peeking under the blind closest to me. To this day, I remember the teacher walking 40 meters until he was behind a tree. From my angle, I could see him. He was just standing there for 2 minutes, then came back and told the other teachers he saw nothing, but that they should call the police just in case. He was too darn scared to check it out himself. Well, I feel you, bro. Anyway, later that night, 2 cops arrived, and a few minutes later, 2 more vans pulled up. We were sent home. Some of the parents weren't happy to come and fetch us at 10 p.m., and the children who didn't have lifts had to go sleep at the teachers' houses. We were never told what the cops found that night. So I did some digging, many years later, as I'm 16 now. The creepy thing was, the Monday that we went to school again, my group and I went to the tree where we saw 2 men. The tree had lots of cuts in it, clearly by some knife. There were also numbers written all over the tree, but the sight of a big body-sized hole covered up with sand made my group and I decide not to sit there anymore. What I found out was that this mentally ill person was coerced to bury a body there that night. We were incredibly close to it when we were playing hide and seek, and I'm so glad we didn't venture any further, as our fates might have been the same as the poor soul who was being put in the ground of our school. My family and I have been hunting the same property in East Texas for over 10 years, and we've had some really creepy encounters with one of the locals. The property we hunt on is timber company land. It's way off the beaten path down some dirt roads. No power, no running water, no sewer. There are very few people that live in the area. Only a few scattered hunting camps and some locals. Our closest neighbors live in a trailer about a mile away, who we've come to call the meth house. Now, I'm not sure if there really is any meth going on there, but it would be hard to believe there isn't. This place has always been odd. There is a trailer sitting in the middle of a pine clearing. The brush is fairly overgrown around the trailer, almost as if the property is abandoned. There have always been broken down cars and other junk strewn throughout the front. Cow skulls and hip bones are attached to a pine tree in front of the house, going up about 15 to 20 feet. It started out with maybe 10, and over the years has grown to about 20. For a long time, I thought that was the oddest thing about the place. 2017, things started to get weirder. The front yard collection began to grow. A rotted out taxidermy of a wild hog was added to the skull tree. A doll head was fixed with horns and some kind of gown and mounted on a stick by the side of the dirt road that we called the baby devil. tripods standing about 12 feet high. Each were erected around the trailer made out of young pine tree trunks. One day we drove by and noticed that from these tripods hung the spinal column and rib cages of some animals. We originally thought that maybe they were using the tripods to hang and clean deer, but the same bones hung for over a year, and someone would usually want to dispose of the leftover carcass because the smell can get overwhelmingly fierce very quickly. So, we had no encounters with the residents and weren't even sure what they looked like. The place was creepy, but they kept to themselves until later in the season, where we had two separate creepy encounters. The first happened to a good friend. He had made a quick day trip with his wife up to the property to fill feeders and ride four-wheelers. To get to his spot, he had to go on the dirt road and drive right past the meth house. His spot is only a few hundred yards away from the house. While they were doing their thing, they began to hear some strange noises. As he listened closer, he could hear fast, high-pitched gibberish back and forth between two voices. He described it as a lot of yips, yas, and yees, and the word Jesus mixed in. They decided to get on one of the four-wheelers and investigate. They found two men squatted down, picture Gollum Lord of the Rings style, besides a large mud puddle in front of the house. They were splashing and bouncing around while furious and loudly speaking gibberish. Once they noticed the four-wheelers, they in unison stopped talking and stared like an animal that has been spooked. My buddy took off on the four-wheeler and didn't look back. The second semi-encounter happened to me and my brother. We were up there alone for this weekend and were relaxing by the fire on a pitch-black night after a long day's hunt. We began to hear something strange off in the distance. It was pipe organ music. There were missed notes and sporadic stops and starts. We laughed about how this seems like the setup in a horror movie and tried to ignore it. The music continued on and off for the next few hours. Then all of a sudden we hear crashing through the brush. This was very thick brush, about 10 feet high and 100 feet or so deep, in between our camp and the direction of the house. This didn't sound like the usual spooked deer, armadillo rooting around, or hogs coming down the trail. It was a crash made by something large, and it was close. The rest of the night was quiet. No more organ music and no more noises in the woods. Likely, just a local little old lady practicing her organ for Sunday service the next morning, drifting over for another property. Likely it was some animal that got spooked crashing through the brush, but we sure were freaked. We made a point to not be alone overnight ever again, and kept a close eye on that house from now on. Currently my boys are 8 and 6. At the time, they were 4 and 2. We had been living in a place for about 5 to 6 months, and my oldest, who isn't firing on any cylinders to be honest, kept walking to the corner, looking up, and talking. He was still doing a lot of babbling until he was almost 6, and then after a few times he walked over, grabbed his younger brother by the hand, walked him to the corner, and he also looked up, started talking, and they were both smiling and giggling, like an adult was interacting with them. After my youngest's 3rd trip over, I asked, "What in the world are you two doing?" thinking it was some kind of game. My oldest giggled and said, "I'm talking to Grandpa." I'm confused. "Baby, your grandpa lives in Nebraska. He's very far away." My child looks at me and replies, "No, Mummy, it's your grandpa." As I said, my oldest was still doing a lot of babbling, so for him to suddenly speak so clearly and in a complete coherent thought was very unnerving. I look at the corner. Both my boys are talking and showing toys up to the corner. I watch for a few minutes. This all happened over a grand total of about half hour. Babies, come watch your movie so mum can finish dinner, because little ones have zero logic. The younger one waddles over and sits down. The eldest picks up the toys that had accumulated in the corner and put them away and sat next to his brother. I start dinner and I keep looking at the corner. Shot in the dark. Thanks, Grandpa. The door in the corner fell open like someone walked through it, and there was a heightened feeling in the room afterwards. That night, I had a dream of my childhood home, and on the path back to the woods there was a small building, granite like a mausoleum, but was little more than an awning. One wall that held a door, 4 pillars, and a bench swing. I walked to it and lit an incense and sat on the swing and started rocking, staring at the ground. Then, there they were, those old ratty sneakers. My grandpa was sitting next to me with that smile, sitting on the swing. I just started talking, mostly about the boys. I told him I missed him so much that I named my oldest after him. He just sat and listened with that smile on his face. After a while, we both stood up. I hugged him and told him I hadn't told him everything yet. Then my name was called from somewhere. I looked around, didn't see anyone, but I looked back and he was gone. I yanked the door open, and it went into this vertical shaft, endless in both directions, completely lined with doors. I woke up crying amidst a panic attack. My grandfather died in about 2005, my grandmother in 2008, and my son was born in 2010, just 1 week shy of my grandfather's birthday, which happened to be the day the doctor scheduled me to originally be induced. Summer 1980. Me and my family had a tradition of going down to our log cabin in the middle of the woods. We would make s'mores, tell jokes, and enjoy each other's company for about a week. This was the excuse to see the extended family, so that we didn't have to necessarily all see each other on the holidays when we were inevitably busy with other things and other family members. So it was generally agreed that the summer week was sacred amongst family. There's one family member in particular who was slightly estranged and had only started coming to these gatherings a few years prior. Most of our interactions with her were limited to these occasions. I am talking of my Aunt Muriel. She had been a spinster her entire life, never married, and seemingly never had a love interest according to my family. She was a miserable old cow, in the nicest possible way. She smoked like a chimney on fire, drank an awful lot, and was just generally a very miserable person. And that's me trying to tell you the best of her. So even though she's family, we tried our best to keep her at bay, because the moment she started drinking, which she did a lot, her mood would go down, and she'd get angry very quickly. With that being said, as you can imagine, none of us were particularly looking forward to seeing her. This year we were informed that she had come down a few days early to the cabin. It was swelteringly hot that year, and was apparently going to prepare the beds for everyone and stock the fridge. So when the day comes around, we start making our way. Remember that this is in the 80s, so there's no cell phones or anything of the like. and the fact that we hadn't heard from her in a while was not uncommon in the slightest. We are the first to get there. Me and my sister jump out the car as my parents immediately go to the trunk and start getting our things to unpack. I open the door and am met with a stench so foul, my nostrils nearly exploded. I wanted to vomit there and then. I had no idea what the smell could be, and only as I approached further into the cabin, despite my sister's protest, did I see the genesis of such. There was Auntie Muriel, on the floor in a pool of blood, dead. She had clearly been there a few days. The smell was overwhelming. As I said before, it was very hot here during the summer, and it didn't take kind on her festering body, not to mention the fact that she was very overweight. In any case, we screamed, ran outside and got my parents, who after one sniff and hearing our explanation didn't even bother going in to check. They had to go out to town to find a phone, which was a near 40-minute drive, get in contact with the authorities, and then come back. About 3 hours later, some of our other relatives have arrived, cousins, uncles, and aunts. And finally, the cops arrive. They have about 20 of us just sitting outside the cabin. We look up in dismay as they do what they need to do. They tell us it's best that we go. Some of the adults stay behind, and my uncle ferries us to his farmhouse not too far away. When we arrive, we're all just sitting there in silence, unsure as to what to do. It was a very dark night. We all end up crashing at my uncle's house over the next few days. The adults are arranging funeral care, while also being in contact with the police to make sure that no foul play was involved before they can return the body. It was unpleasant to say the least. When all the information came back, it turns out she had died of natural causes. Apparently she had had a heart attack, slipped and fallen, broken a bone in her leg and her hip, and bled out there and then. Pretty nasty way to go if you ask me. She had been there for approximately 3 days, so she died pretty much the day she arrived. That was disappointing, I thought. Even though I didn't like her all that much, no one deserves to go out like that. We never returned to that cabin. It was sold, and I don't know what happened to it, and our family reunions were now held elsewhere. But one lasting impression remains. Since that day, I have refused to go into a cabin, for the events that transpired then have scarred me for life. Back in 2001, I was 21, working in a hotel bar 10 miles from my home. This was on Christmas Eve. I had to work that night. The hotel was open and I was the new kid on the job, so I had to. I closed the bar at 2 a.m., went to change my clothes, and went to my motorcycle. It was really cold at the time, so sometimes I would take a very narrow country road that cutted my trip almost to half, which was only used by residents of a few houses. I used it as I could exit near the main road on the motorcycle. A car could not. It was me and my friend from work on the motorcycle, and after maybe a mile in said road, in the middle of nowhere, near one of the houses, I saw something when passing by the house gate. I then stopped maybe 60 to 80 feet from the house gate. We both looked back, and there it was. like straight out of a movie. The typical Hollywood alien. It looked 6.5 to 7 feet tall, with grey skin, the oval face, the dark eyes, the complete package. We stared at it for 10 seconds, and it stared back at us. Then I proceeded to get the hell out of there. We both agreed to ourselves that it was just an idiot in a costume. For the next few years, I told this story to some close friends and family, just like I'm telling you now. We then went to separate jobs, but would occasionally see my friends, and we would always share a laugh about it. But we would always say, what the hell was a guy doing in an alien costume at 2 a.m. on Christmas in the middle of nowhere, in those pitch black woods? Now I'm 36 years old, and I'm a science kind of guy. I do believe that we are not alone, but I find it hard to believe 99% of the stuff we read. I would still like to think it was just an idiot in a costume, but I will forever think, what the hell? I was 13 and in a wilderness treatment program for behavioral stuff. The place was out in the mountains of southern Utah, by a place called Joe's Camp. Plenty of weird stuff happened out there, and I have a few stories, but this freaked me out the most, and the physical feeling I got, I can still conjure up today. One night we were sitting around the fire telling scary stories, and the topic of wendigos came up. Some swore up and down that they were real, and one staff member said they were old tales of encounters in the area. We bantered about it for a few minutes, and then, being the edgy teen I was, I blurted out something like, "Screw a wendigo, I'll kill one with my bare hands if it shows itself." And later that night, when I was asleep, I had this dream. I was basically watching this deer in a clearing, and I had the worst feeling ever of doom. And then suddenly this deer is crushed, I mean obliterated, like I really can't describe it. It was kind of sucked up under a big rock, and its spinal cord flew out and impaled me. And I got the feeling when I was impaled, and it was the worst and weirdest pain I've ever had. The best way to describe it was like a dirty scraping feeling. I was then, in the dream, looking at my feet out at the end of my tarp tent, and I was ripped out the tent. I woke up suddenly and was sitting in my sleeping bag outside my tent, making the strangest noise I've ever heard. It was like a wheezing screech, a primal death cry. I looked around, quickly crawled back to my tent, and wrote it off as a bad dream, and didn't really speak about it while I was there. I don't know how to plausibly explain it, other than a weird dream and sleepwalking, but it definitely jarred me, and when I remember it, I can't help but feel incredibly uneasy. I am a female in my late 20s. My parents, a charming lesbian couple, owned a funeral home and cemetery in a village on the outskirts of the Alaskan tundra. It was a small business that had been passed down from my grandmother Agatha's father, who inherited it from his father, and so on. Katie, my other mother, was terrified of the whole situation from the beginning. She was positive that someone would get possessed with us living so close to a field of corpses, in her words. Over time, exactly 8 years after they moved there, she grew to respect the land, as well as the tenants resting in peace there. I was born shortly after her change of heart, but she still limited my access to the cemetery. And while no one was ever possessed, we still had our fair share of terrifying experiences at our home and throughout the property. I went to a tiny schoolhouse every weekday from the time I could walk. Only 13 or so children lived in our town, so we were all educated in one room by a small group of teachers. Katie and her twin sister Gloria were two of these teachers. The three of us would walk to and from town every day, while Aga and her brother Cal took care of the property. It was a 20-minute trek, but on the occasional day without freezes, we got to take our bikes, and that was generally the highlight of my life. However, on this particular day in December, we had to walk. We were only at the school until about 4 o'clock that afternoon, but the sun usually set around 3:30, so we were shrouded mostly in darkness by the time we got up to the dirt road leading up to our property. I was about 6 or 7 at the time, and still used my clumsiness as an excuse not to walk up the path, muddied by snow. Glory had drawn the short straw and was giving me a piggyback ride up the hill. I was resting my head against her back and staring at the cemetery that was beginning to come into view around the paper birches and spruce trees. It was a sprawling field filled with an odd assortment of mausoleums, colourful tombs of Inuit and the Russian Orthodox citizens, and I was always entranced by the graves and tried to pick out the ones that I had yet to see. We were nearly to the house when I saw a figure standing in the far right corner of the cemetery. It was hard to discern their age or gender, but I could tell from the build that it wasn't Aga or Cal. Visiting hours ended at sundown regardless of the date, so I immediately pointed the person out to Katie. Most of the finer details are recalled by my parents and older family members, due to my young age throughout most of these events, but I can still clearly remember hearing Katie mutter, "Shit," quietly under her breath. She helped me off Glory's back and ordered that I go inside to tell Cal to meet them in the field. Without hesitation, I suddenly found myself as sure-footed as a bunny on the icy ground and sprinted the last 20 or so yards up to the house. I swung the door open and went into the kitchen where I knew I'd find Aga and Cal, and told my uncle to get the trespasser. Groaning, Cal finished his cup of coffee, which was probably spiked with whiskey, and stood from the table. Angak Cal was a big guy, about 6'8", with broad shoulders and what I called Fred Flintstone fists. Basically, he could knock someone out without much effort, and he did so time and time again. He was insanely protective of his sisters and all of the other women in his life, Glory and Katie included. The entire town respected him and feared him at the same time. He was a nice home security system. Naturally, I was thrilled with this tiny bit of excitement in my normally humdrum life. When my uncle charged out the back without so much as a coat on, I turned my pleading eyes to Aga, who barely flinched at the activity. She stared back at me for only a moment, before sighing and motioning to the rack by the door. I grabbed her parka and helped her put it on as we made our way outside. Knowing that her wife was going to be none too thrilled with my presence in the cemetery, Aga picked me up when we reached the cast iron fence that surrounded the property. We could see Cal's giant silhouette approaching the tiny ones of Katie and Glory. The stranger was still a good 100 or so yards from us. "Let's hide and watch," I whispered to Aga, when I realized that Katie hadn't spotted us yet. For a moment, I thought my mother would shake her head and go to the others, but she surprised me by giving me a conspiring smile and ducked behind a mausoleum. "We can get to Grandmother's grave if we're very quiet," she told me with a glint in her eye. She loved the graveyard and had spent her childhood playing in it, while also learning about her ancestors and the people of her town. She wanted me to enjoy it as much as she did. We hurried from grave to grave, pausing only long enough to make sure the others didn't see us. Katie, Glory, and Cal were moving swiftly as well, but they were too busy eyeing the figure, standing only about 20 feet from the large tomb that encased my great-grandmother, our destination. When we arrived at the tomb, Arga set me down, and we crouched behind the rocks and wood that surrounded Grandmother's altar. It was then that I began to feel nerves eat away at my gut. This was a stranger, I could tell. They were standing at the base of the mausoleum, built to honor the infants who had passed before being blessed by the tribe's shaman. This was an old, outdated site that didn't fully honor Inuit customs, though it had been redone in the 1970s, closer to the northern section of the property. No one came to this site because it would be considered disrespectful to their deceased, but it would have just been as disrespectful to tear it down. So, it was just a derelict memorial that loomed on the tiny hilltop of that section of the cemetery. Tension filled the air as Cal, flanked by Katie and Glory, approached the stranger. I could hear my uncle speaking to them, likely telling them our hours and asking them if they'd like a ride back into town. He always started off nice, giving people the benefit of the doubt before going into Hulk mode. Arga, who had initially been giggling at the sight of her brother looming over the trespasser, was beginning to cling tighter to me as time went by. It took us a few minutes to realize that the person hadn't been responding to Cal, nor had they even looked his way. They continued to stare at the area just above the mausoleum. Katie and Gloria were exchanging uneasy glances at one point, and Cal told them to go back to the house. They refused and stepped closer to his side. When words failed, Cal resorted to the physical approach. He later recalled that he could tell the person was an old man, and that they were frail, and that he didn't want to hurt them. But he wasn't listening, and if he was deaf, he'd have to get his attention somehow. My uncle placed a gentle hand on the gentleman's shoulder, and immediately he felt a wave of nausea overcome him. He hunched over, clutching his abdomen, and cried out. Arga ordered me to stay put before darting off out from behind the stones and over to her brother, who waved to her and the other women to make them leave. He insisted they go inside, but they were all frozen in place. The strange man still hadn't moved, so Katie yelled at him once more. She stepped around in front of him and waved a hand in his face. "You need to leave." I'd heard her command. "You can't be here after dark, it's not safe." "No, it's not," the stranger finally said. He lowered his eyes to meet at my mother. "Are you all right, dear?" He spoke so casually to her. She stood there in shock for a good moment. She looked back at Cal, who was on his knees at this point. While she was distracted, the man turned and headed towards the exit. When he was coming towards my hiding spot, I had every intention of getting up and running away, but I was frozen in place. It felt like my body was being held down by weights, and I was sinking into the earth. I whimpered and buried my face in my arms, praying to God and my great-grandmother for safety. The ice and leaves crunched in my ears, and I knew Arga realized my predicament and said something to the others, because I could hear Katie shouting at her. Finally summoning the courage, I looked up to see the man walking right by me. He didn't so much as look my way, but as he passed he said, "Good night, Blue Eyes," in a dulcet whisper. Immediately I relaxed and climbed to my feet. I watched him practically float out of the cemetery and towards the road. Katie came and got me, telling me we had to take my uncle to the hospital. As it turns out, Cal had to go in for some emergency surgery because his appendix had ruptured. He's convinced that the old man somehow cursed him on contact. Even Arga, sweet but superstitious Arga, had her doubts about his claim. There was nothing malicious in Cal's approach to the man. Why would he have cursed him? This wasn't the last time we saw this strange man. We actually saw him 2 or 3 more times in the following weeks. He was always at the derelict infant's mausoleum, staring up at the sky. He never spoke or bothered anyone, and from that point on he always came while it was light out. I would sometimes sneak out and watch him from my grandmother's grave. He was a white man, which struck a chord with me. It was my theory that he was Katie and Gloria's real father, who had abandoned them when they were still very young. Katie quickly disproved this theory, telling me that their father died in the early 90s. But that meant nothing to me. It could still be him. The last time I saw him was in early February the following year. It was snowing heavily, and I was helping Arga and Cal go about and check to see if all the tombs and mausoleums were closed. Sometimes family members of the deceased would perform rituals on their newly departed, placing ceremonial offerings on their bodies, but they weren't always restored to their tombs to the way they were. We did our best to ensure that none of the graves would be flooded come the next thaw. When we approached grandmother's grave, I heard Arga sigh airily, but continued on. Immediately, I looked to the old mausoleum and smiled to the back of the old man. "Good morning," I called out to him. "There's no such thing, Blue Eyes." I heard him respond this over the wind. I began to laugh because it sounded like something Gloria would say after a night of drinking. But suddenly I felt a ball of sadness coil up in my stomach. I began crying and looked up at Arga with a sorrowful pout. It was the first time I had really ever felt dread, and it nearly brought me to my knees. Arga picked me up and took me inside, where I instantly felt better. The man was never seen on the property again. I was a little sad about it, but the adults were glad. They didn't like the pull that he had on us.